Hello, welcome to my latest tutorial. In this one we're going to be looking at nighttime photography and low light photography. This is all about long exposures at night, getting your camera lovely and steady on a tripod or fixed against a wall, kind of wedged in position, and then suddenly you can start working with exposures of 10, 20 seconds and really dragging out light, seeing detail that you can't see with your own eyes. I really enjoy the fact that with photography you can enhance how you see the world. I've mentioned this in a few of my other tutorials. You can see fine detail, you can see all types of light and colour that you wouldn't see with your own eyes. And night photography was the first time I really noticed that, by using long exposures, going above a second, 10 seconds. Suddenly a pitch black scene that you can barely see any detail suddenly has tons of light. If you shoot a moonlit valley with no houses around, do a 30-second exposure of that, it can look like daylight, and that was fascinating to me. In this tutorial we're going to look at that. We're going to start playing with longer exposures. There's a few things. Let me just list what we're going to do. We're going to look at a slideshow of my nighttime photography, and I'm going to talk you through some of the ideas behind that and some of the locations. And then we're going to look at camera settings. I'm going to show you about ISO, shutter speed and aperture, and then about pushing that shutter speed. That's where you have your control of night photography. You can take your shutter speed to 30 seconds. You can hold the bulb setting and do a 2-minute exposure if you want, and soak up so much light. And then I'm going to show you about how to secure your camera very well using a tripod, really good tripod techniques, so you can do long exposures. And then we're going to do a couple of shots using low light, show how those longer exposures pick up more and more detail as they get longer and longer. Also at night you get very contrasty scenes often, especially if you're photographing in a city. You might have the arc lights of a car park, but then the very dark shadow areas as well. So blending exposure is very useful when you're doing night photography. You can take detail from the very shadowy areas with a long exposure and then do a quick exposure on the lights. I'm not going to go too much into detail about how to pull those blended images together, because I've done another tutorial about blending exposures, which I'll put a link to below. But I'll go into that a little bit. Then I'm going to do a couple of other examples. I'm going to take this on location. There's a couple of places I'm going to visit. Beautiful view of Manchester, and a lovely view of the motorway cutting through the hills, which will show how long exposures can create trails of light. And then a couple of little extra bonus things. I'm going to do a very starting point of astrophotography. So photographing the moon is relatively simple. It's incredibly bright. The sun is hitting it. It's an object with the sun hitting it. So I'll quickly show you how to photograph the moon, which is really good fun, and then we'll have a quick look at video making. I've not talked about that too much in my tutorial so far, but we'll look at time-lapse video making, so how you can blend long exposures together and have these streaks of light moving through the hills, have the motorway lights kind of blending and blurring through time-lapse photography. And I'll do a very, very quick 2-minute demo on how to put those together in After Effects. So it's a tutorial that's just packed full of ideas. It's basically a big overview of low light and nighttime photography, approaching it from lots of directions. So I hope it's useful. I've put some points in the, some times in the description, so if you want to move to different bits and see how to set up the camera or tripod set technique, you can see that in the description below the video. But yeah, thanks for watching. We're going to move on with the slideshow now, and I'm going to talk about some of my favourite nighttime photography I've done and the ideas behind that and the locations, and then we'll move on to techniques, setting up your camera and things like that. So enjoy, and I hope you find this useful. I'm going to share some of my favourite nighttime photographs that I've taken over the last 15 or so years. This one is from the Brecon Beacons. It was a very snowy trip. We were there and there was a beautiful full moon, and it was a really nice blend of light, the light from the moon hitting the landscape, showing the snow, the light from the phone box, and then you can just see that kind of fading daylight in the distance. And this is something we're going to talk about quite a lot in this tutorial, this idea of waiting for the ratio of available light, moonlight, daylight to change, and sometimes it just hits this point where it's really magical. And I think this photograph's a good example of that, of just all those three light sources blending in a really kind of sympathetic way that gives it this kind of nice atmosphere and brings out that red and that blue, those colours that come with the different light sources. This is one from Northumberland. It's a dark sky park there, so there's big gaps where in the countryside where there's not that many towns nearby, so you can really see the stars clearly. There's not much light pollution at all, so it's great for night photography. You can just get the light of the stars, although you can see here those colours
near the horizon are the colours of nearby towns and villages. So you do get a little bit of light pollution, but looking straight up it's really clear. And this is quite a long exposure. As you can see, the blur of the clouds is because it might be a 5 or 6 second exposure to capture that light. And this is from the same evening, shooting up, looking at the Milky Way, that diagonal strip that kind of goes left to right at a slight upward angle is the Milky Way. I got amongst trees and photographed looking up, so you've got the light of the Milky Way shining down, the glow of all the stars, and they're backlighting the skeletal trees, the skeletal kind of winter trees. So you have that kind of, those shapes interacting, the bright lights plus the kind of reaching out shapes of the branches and the trees above. This is one where I tried to kind of mimic how a view looks, so I didn't push the exposure. I didn't do a very long exposure on this. I kept it fairly close to how this view looked in front of me. And sometimes at night your eyes adjust and you see the landscape, but you don't see everything clearly. Things can look quite dark, particularly where you've got trees or you've got shadows. They can be really solid black. So I tried to really remember what this view looked like while I was there, and the amount of light, the amount of detail, the amount of colour. And I just tried to mimic that, just tried to not let it go really bright, tried to kind of capture vision. And this one's totally the opposite. This is actually a moonlit shot as well, but it looks like the middle of the day. It looks like you've got the bright sun shining down, but actually that is just the sunlight bouncing off a full moon, and that moon is acting like a reflector. And because it's reflecting sunlight, you still have that same spectrum of colours that you would in the middle of the day. So you still see the pinks and the greens and the yellows and the colours of the flowers. It's just an awful lot more faint. So in this image, to really make the most of that light, reflected light from the moon, which is thousands of times dimmer and less bright than the sunlight, to make the most of that faint light, I had to do a long exposure. I think this was a 30-second exposure. And I also pushed my ISO higher in this. I think I was working at about 1500 ISO to really kind of capture this detail and bring out this light and colour. You can capture amazing effects, things that you can only just see with your eyes. So this was from an evening walk in the Peak District, and I was about to head home, and I hadn't used my head torch, I hadn't used my phone in a while, so my eyes had become really adjusted to the low light. And just as I was about to head back, I turned and I noticed this faint halo around the sun. So I got my camera out and started doing longer exposures, and suddenly I saw that within that halo you have the spectrum of the of sunlight that you'd see, the same kind of spectrum of a rainbow in that kind of circle around the moon. And by doing the longer exposures, I could really bring that out, really emphasize that, and see this detail that you can just about see with your eyes. Now we're taking it to the city. Nighttime photography can be brilliant when you've got artificial light, so the lights of a city, the lights of a town, buildings. You can use long exposures to make that faint light of a city really glow, look very kind of neon lit. This one's on the top of Manchester Town Hall. I did a project exploring loads of interesting, rarely seen places in Manchester. And I did long exposures again. You can see that blur of the sky. And I think I used a range of exposures here. So the city was exposed one way, maybe a 2 or 3 second exposure. But then the light on the rocks right in front of me and the stones of the town hall was so faint, I had to do maybe a 15, 20 second exposure there just to get that light that's hitting it, that I think is probably the reflected light of the city bouncing off the clouds. So very faint, just to make the most of that faint light and really emphasize it and have detail throughout the picture. Here's another cityscape. This is one of the first really sort of successful nighttime photographs I did. This is probably about 15 years old now. And it's looking from a tower block in Salford onto Manchester, which is the area to the right of the railway tracks. That black shape is the railway tracks. And then in front of you here, the suburban area is Salford. So I kind of wanted to contrast the two cities, really. And this was very early on when I was building images out of loads of photographs, and I was letting them go quite organic, quite kind of almost liquid shapes. So you've got this kind of this gently kind of swaying horizon that bends up. It's kind of got this fluid composition, which I don't do so much of now, but early on I was really sort of playing with Photoshop and really trying to kind of create these quite organic, quite unusual compositions through how I build them. Here's another city one, and this is working with the long exposure is creating motion blur in the headlights of the cars. So you've probably got like a 1 or 2 second exposures as those cars creep by. So you get that nice bit of energy, that nice blur of the red lights, and then you've got the other cars over the other side that are kind of blurring as well. And towards the end of this tutorial, we're going to look at a shoot I did from a motorway bridge, which is capturing that blur of headlights. So we can go into that in more detail and tell you how to manage that, and then how to use Photoshop to use blurs from different vehicles in different photographs and bring them together into one image. So we'll have a look at that later. And here's another cityscape, the beautiful skyline of Liverpool from across the Mersey. And with this, I loved the way the lights and the colours of the city reflected in the water. And being a long exposure, you don't see the waves, you see this kind of lovely kind of ghostly reflections of the lights and the colours. Here's another city one, but I tried to really give this a kind of an old-fashioned feel. I wanted this almost to look like an image from the 50s or the kind of scene and the kind of person you might see in a Lowry painting. So I went for these sepia tone feels. I looked at the colour that, I did some research into the colour that gas lamps give out, and it was a kind of greeny, bluey, slightly strange colour. So I tried to match that in with this shot and then get the moonlight and the city and the kind of cobbles, clip those with some lights I brought along. Here's one where I again tried to mimic what a view looked like in front of me. So this is a scene in Cornwall near St Keverne on the Lizard Peninsula, and it was a full moon again. In fact, it's the same night as I photographed that view of the flowers that almost look like daylight that I showed earlier. But this one, I deliberately let it look like moonlight. I let it go low key, but show the kind of detail you see once your eyes adjust, just to kind of mimic moonlight and what that looks like. And here's a picture from the church in Heptonstall. There's a graveyard and churchyards with two churches, and this is a church of Thomas the Becket, and this is the collapsed ruined church. And I'll come clean on this. This is not an image that was taken at night, but I used the image we looked at, I'll just go back to that now, the landscape in Cornwall, as a reference to what moonlight looks like. And I kept dodging between the two images and thinking, how's that moon going to hit it? The colours, the coldness of the greens of the plants, the little bit of colour you see in the sky. I really wanted to kind of mimic moonlight, but this was actually the middle of a sunny day, so it took lots of retouching, lots of recolouring, lots of draining the colours out of things, and then dropping in that sky, that moonlit sky with the stars, to put it all together. So yeah, I used images of moonlight as a reference, but this is all daylight mixed with that night sky. Now we're looking at the Clifton Suspension Bridge. We're going to look at a few photographs now where bracketing exposures came in really useful. So this is using a number of exposures of the same view and blending them in Photoshop. So with this, I wanted to have the Clifton Suspension Bridge lighting the landscape. So the lights, it's quite a bright object in the landscape. I did long exposures, so all the rocks in front and the green and the trees and the bushes nearby were lit by the bridge. That was through quite a long exposure, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and then the bridge was just so bright, it was just absolutely glowing. So I used much shorter exposures for the bridge and blended them together, so you can see the detail in the bridge, but then also you can see the detail in the landscape that is seen because of the light that's kind of emitting from the bridge. Here's another one which used a lot of bracketing, so there's quite a lot of range of exposure here between the moonlight hitting the snow and defining the landscape and the Brecon beacons, right through to the windows of this cottage. And I used a much shorter exposure so I could get detail of the curtains, and that wasn't absolutely bleached white. I was able to control that through a range of maybe 6 or 7 exposures. I could slowly hand over to the brighter detail using Photoshop again. And here's another. I'm going to show a few images that use what I think of as available light. So these are daylight images, but very low light because the available light there is quite faint. And I really, whenever I can, I try not to use flash. I try not to take my own lighting to locations because I think available light always has so much more atmosphere and character. So this is a tiny bit of light coming through the entrance of the cave. This is Cathedral Caverns in the Lake District. There's a tiny bit of light coming through that entrance, which is obscured by the column in the middle of the slate mine. And by using long exposures, I could take that tiny bit of detail that's hitting the rock and emphasize it, make it really strong, right to the back of the cave where there's hardly any light hitting it. So it's the same idea as we're using in these night photographs, but you can use them to make the most of available light in daytime when that available light happens to be really faint. And here's another, which is where the available light is actually artificial light. So it's the light inside this old theatre, but get my camera on a tripod. I don't need to take my own lights there. I can do a range of exposures of this and then paint through the detail I want. So capture that little bit of detail, clipping the steps in front, which probably didn't have much light hitting them, but then get good detail right inside the theatre behind, which was probably quite a lot brighter. So you can use a tripod and the same techniques in this tutorial to make the most of available light. And another one, this is inside the Godley Observatory, or the Goodley Observatory, I'm not sure which one it is, in Manchester, looking at the telescope through the hatch at Manchester, again using available light. You have red lights inside this observatory because then you don't lose your night vision. You don't get dazzled by the red light, so you can still look through the telescope and see what's out there. And here's another one, not using available light. I bought all the lights and put them in here myself, but all of these lights are candles. So I managed to get about 150 candles and slowly fill this place with candles everywhere. Loads outside the door, some next to me as kind of fill-in lights, then some in the little alcoves. And we had so many, and then I used very long exposures to make that candle light just really define this place, define the walls and the floor. And then again, through bracketing, I was able to make the candles so you can see the shapes of the light as well by using a range of exposures. Here's another one inside a culvert in Manchester. The river Medlock runs near Phillips Park, and we went in there, and this is very bracketed again, so the light right near the entrance is really bright, or quite bright, but right inside the cave it's that same light, but that it's getting more and more faint as it gets nearer the camera, because it's having less power to it, less shape, because it's just bouncing off the walls. It's not got direct light hitting it. So I used longer exposures as the walls got nearer to me. So as you've got the bricks right in the foreground and right near the camera, that would be using much longer exposure. And I think with this one, because it was so dark and there was so little light coming through, I used a little popper flash just to light out the water. You can see some definition in the water. If I hadn't have used that, there was not enough light to have got anything in there. And a little popper flash to bring in detail to those foreground bricks as well. Just a little pop near the camera, and that kind of gave me definition. But again, it's built out so many pictures, so I'll have pictures of those bricks where it hasn't got that extra light, and then somewhere it has, and then I'll use Photoshop to bring the detail through as I want to. And this one is totally lit by me walking around it with a flash gun and firing that flash in all these different places, moving the camera to different positions, and then using Photoshop to blend all those little bursts of flash. You can use blending modes to kind of get all those bursts of flash and make it look like all those little pops of light that happened over half an hour. Me walking into the shot, many photographs were simultaneous, were all happening at the same time. So it's lit by loads and loads of light sources, but all of those light sources, me with the same flash gun walking around this space. You can see that on the wall on the right, you can see the kind of light of that archway shape coming through. That will be me stood just behind that arch with the flash there. And then you can see, if you look on the left, that reflection in the wall, that's me stood near the wall, the reflection of the flash. So it's slowly filling it with light and slowly painting that whole area and filling it with all these little sharp bursts of light, which I then blend together. Here's Manchester. Again, we're looking at that kind of handover from daytime to nighttime, and how important it is. If you really want to make the city glow, you have to wait until sunset's a long time past. Darkness takes a long time to arrive. We'll look at that later. I do an animation that shows darkness arriving at a city, and you might look at it and think the city's dark, but there might be quite a lot of daylight bouncing off the sky. So sometimes you have to wait for an hour and a half after sunset to get true darkness. And in that time from sunset to true darkness, you get a lovely range of light. You get the ratio of the light from the city and the light in the sky slowly changes all the time. And within there, you might get a really interesting point where the light really has a nice feel to it. So don't just wait for pitch black, or if you're doing sunset photography, don't just wait for the sunset and then pack up, because there's this slowly changing light as you sit and watch. And here's another demonstrating that same thing. I did a shoot in Iceland in 2015, and in Iceland you get very short days in January, and this was about 4 p.m, but you get very long dusks. So I had to keep shooting to make the most of my time there. So I've got so many shots kind of making the most of the sun being over the horizon and creating this kind of glow on the landscape. And by using a tripod and long exposures, you can emphasize that faint glow that you might only just see with your eyes, you can make much more strong. And you can see I'm using long exposures here through the kind of blurs and movements on the waves in the water. And another one, again, waiting for that ratio of daylight to kind of change that ratio with the lights, the artificial lights of the city. And suddenly you get this moment where it really zings. The light of the sky is really solid blue, and you've got these lovely warm kind of tungsten lights of the city, and they all combine together in a way that probably wouldn't have looked as good 10 minutes earlier, and it wouldn't look as good 10 minutes later. There's just a lovely moment where it all clicks together. And here's one where you just let at the last glow of the day disappear. This is one of Manchester from the Ashbury's train station, where you see the distant city towers. I was up there watching the light slowly fade and just had this lovely atmosphere as kind of nighttime arrived. I've got a few at the end here which are kind of special examples, ideas that are really unusual that I tried out. This is from Koh Phi Phi in Thailand, and I sat there watching a thunderstorm out on the Andaman Sea, maybe about 40 miles away, and you could see the lightning. It was so far away you couldn't hear the thunder at all. You could just see the whole sky lighting up. So I sat there with my camera, and I just kept the camera clicking. I put my camera so it just kept doing continuous shooting. So it's click, 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 click. And probably each of those clicks was 1 second long, a 1 second exposure. So the lightning had a bit of time to strike. And then I slowly, over about 20 minutes, caught all these bursts of lightning. I moved the camera left to right to capture this kind of range of detail. It's a panoramic as well. And then back in my studio, I was able to use blending modes and take all those individual bursts of lightning over half an hour and make them all happen at once. We'll look at that in one of the last bits in this tutorial, where we look at how to blend the blurs of car headlights. It's the same technique. You use the lightest bit of the image and overlay that with the lightest bits of the image below, and so that in this case is just bursts of lightning, so it gets brighter and brighter as you bring in more photographs that contain that burst of lightning, that brightness. Here's one shooting across the water from Kowloon to Hong Kong, and with this one I deliberately shot the city looking very straight and ordered with a still camera, but I wanted to capture some of the energy of the lights and the movement of the city. So I zoomed in, I got the camera blurred, I just created lots of kind of scruffy pictures as well. So you've got the sharp city, but then almost the energy of the city radiating by sort of blending those different bits of lightness and brightness together. Here's one where I did a very long exposure of my hand as it moved through bioluminescence in the water of a Florida lagoon. So this is microorganisms that glow in the water when they're disturbed, and some years they're really good, and this was a year where it was absolutely really bright. So I put my hand in the water, held it really steady, I locked my camera against the side of the kayak I was in so it didn't move at all, and then I had someone gently tow me along in their kayak, and I went through the water really slowly, and because my hand was still and because the camera was still, I could do a 30-second exposure, and that's countless numbers of these bioluminescent organisms moving over my hand, being disturbed, and creating this kind of energy and light, which was a really satisfying thing to capture. And this was a few months later, and it really reminded me of the same night, because some of the colours were very similar in the water to the Northern Lights, and also it's light that's created by a way we're not used to. You've got the bioluminescence in the lagoon, and then you've got the Northern Lights, which is created by the charged particles of the sun kind of interacting with the Earth's magnetic field, and then they hit the atmosphere and you just get these lovely lights in the sky. So again, using very long exposures, I think 25-second exposures here, I could capture the movement and the colours of the lights, the Northern Lights, and I really want to get back there and photograph them more, really kind of capture them in fine detail, because it's the most beautiful thing. And this was a night where there's a few clouds around, so the stars, the Northern Lights, the artificial lights, the road on the left, all of it combined to just create this unforgettable movement and colour and night out in the landscape. Absolutely freezing, but it was very much worth it. This is one on the Mediterranean, looking at the moon, light in the water, moving through the waters. So you've got that kind of highlight of the moon, and we're going towards it, and the blur of the stars as we kind of travel east on the Mediterranean. And a final one, this was photographed fairly recently. This is a comet Neowise. I got up at about 3 a.m, and I couldn't see it to start with. It was fairly faint, but by doing quite long exposures on my camera with quite a wide angle lens, I suddenly noticed this shape in the sky when I looked at the back of my camera, and that allowed me to kind of zero in on it and get a longer lens on it and slowly move in and capture that detail. And this is actually a bracketed exposure as well, so to get that detail in the tail, lots of texture in the tail, meant the head of the comet, the brightest bit, was really flared out. So I used a slightly darker exposure for the brightest bit of the comet, and that meant I could have some detail there, and it just wasn't solid white. It had a little bit of shape to it. So yeah, that's a collection of some of my favourite nighttime photography. We'll now move on with the tutorial, and I'll share some of the ideas that go into making these, and you can try doing some of these yourself. So with nighttime photography and low light photography, it's really useful to have a camera with manual settings and also have a good grip on using those manual settings. You can do this kind of photography with an automatic camera. You might want to use exposure adjustments. If you look that up, that's plus or minusing the exposure the camera wants to do. But having a camera that shoots a camera that shoots manual is really, really useful. I've done a whole other tutorial just focusing on manual settings, which there's a link to in the description of this video, and it's in the same tutorial playlist. And we use this similar info slide in that, and we're going to look at that again, not in quite as much detail, but I'm just going to go through the kind of 3 things you control to control your exposure. So 3 settings: you've got on the left ISO, in the middle aperture, and on the right shutter speed. Now the ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So that can be at 100, and that means your camera isn't very sensitive to light, but you get very detailed, sharp images. If you want to make your camera really sensitive to light, so pick up light when it's really dark, push it up to 2000 and you'll suddenly start seeing much more detail. But the image quality drops away, the colors, you get a strange fuzziness, it doesn't look great. So I always try and keep my ISO fairly low, but you can push it to 500 or 800. Most modern cameras can handle that. So maybe when you're doing your first nighttime photography, try starting about 500 ISO, something along those lines. You'll get a reasonably sharp image, and you won't be needing to do massive long shutter speeds because your camera is kind of quite sensitive to light. In time, you might want to play with putting your ISO right down to 100, so you get the absolute best from the camera. You get really nice, clear, sharp images, and maybe even try pushing it right up to 2000 or 8000. And some cameras go to really high, and then you can pick up incredible amounts of detail and light. So have a play with it, but maybe to start sort of somewhere middling, around 500 or 800. Now we're going to move over to the aperture, and the aperture is essentially the hole that's in the lens that lets light in. So let me just move this around to show what happens. If we go to f22, that means you have a very small aperture, which means not that much light is let through the lens. You can see there's a tiny white dot, that's only a tiny bit of light coming through. And now if you move slowly towards 2.8, it slowly opens that aperture up, and that's happening in your lens. The hole in your lens is getting bigger as you change your aperture, your f-stop. And if we go to f2.8, the lens is wide open, it's letting tons of light in, and you're going to get quite bright shots. So I would say for night photography, maybe start again at a safe one, maybe about f5. There is also a payoff in your aperture where the higher the aperture, so the smaller the hole in the lens, the less light your lens is letting through, the more depth of field you have. That's the amount of the image that's in focus. If you have it right at 2.8, you get a very low depth of field, so you have to be really careful with your focus. Whereas a middling one, f8 or something like f5, you'll get an average amount in focus. So I'd say f5 is a safe one. Your lens is quite open, it's letting in quite a lot of light, but you don't have to be too critical on your focus. So yeah, we'll keep that at f5. And now the really key setting when it comes to night photography is your shutter speed. The other two you have a little bit of room to play with, but shutter speed you have a lot of room to play with. Because you can put your camera on a tripod, you can start working with exposures of 30 seconds, a minute, really long exposures, and that's when you're really soaking up light, because the longer that lens is open, the more light your camera is capturing, the brighter the shots. So at the moment, the range we're seeing is the range for kind of mostly daytime photography. When you get down near a second, you're going to see motion blur. But this is a fairly sort of standard range of exposures. If we're up at 1/1600th of a second, that basically means the lens is open, the click of the camera is a 1/1600th of a second. So that it's open for an amount of time that you can fit into a second, 1/1600th of time. So you can imagine that it's just such a thin sliver of light. It's just this very small amount of light getting in. And then if we, to illustrate, go right down to a second, the lens is open, it opens, and then it closes. You've got 1 second of light. That means it's got all that amount of time to soak the light up. All that light's coming into the lens it's getting brighter and brighter as it picks up all that light from your subject, from whatever you're photographing, and you get very bright images. So at a second, it's very bright. At a 1600th, it's quite dark. Now, for sort of daylight photography, you're kind of working in a range between a 60th of a second and then up to near 1600ths or even quicker. Any slower than a 60th, you're going to start seeing motion blur. So if you get down to a 40th, you might just start seeing a bit of wobble on the image. If you get down to a 60th of a second, you're definitely going to see motion blur unless you're incredibly still and incredibly steady. A second, you will see lots of blur. So anything slower than a 60th, if you want to see it sharp, you get your tripod out, and we do what we've looked at elsewhere in this tutorial about holding your camera perfectly still using a tripod or by wedging it against a wall. But once you've done that, once you've got your tripod, you can then work with incredibly long exposures. So let me just change this screen for a second. We've extended the shutter speed from beyond a second. So we're now looking at shutter speeds. If we move down from a second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15 seconds, and 30 seconds. Now that is the lens of your camera and the chip in your camera picking up light for an extraordinary amount of time. So, for example, at a 30th of a second, you can be in a landscape that's just lit by the moon. You can do it a 30-second exposure of a landscape just lit by the moon, and it can almost look like daylight if you get your aperture and your ISO quite sensitive as well. So yeah, it's all about playing. Once you get beyond a second, you really start picking up detail of light. I mentioned at the start of this tutorial how one of the great things about low light and night photography is you can pick up so much more detail than you can see with your own eyes. So just go out on a dark night, go somewhere that's hardly any light around and do a 4-second exposure or an 8-second exposure, and suddenly you'll be looking at the back of your camera and going, wow, I didn't know that detail was there, because it's just picking up that subtle light and really emphasizing it. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. We're going to be going way beyond a second. We're going to be 2 seconds, 4 seconds to really pick up that light. There is another setting a lot of cameras have, and that, as you can see on the left here, is a B setting, which stands for bulb. That's quite clever if you want to do exposures that go over a 30th of a second, which is the limit of most cameras. On the bulb setting, you press the button and there's a click and your lens is open. And as long as your hand is still holding the shutter down on the camera, it keeps the lens open until you take your finger off. So as soon as you take your finger off, the lens closes again. So you can do exposures of a minute, 2 minute, you can do really long ones. There is one thing to be really careful of with that. Your hand is permanently putting pressure on the camera. You might be moving around, you might be treading on the floor in different places, and you might get motion blur. So be very careful using bulb, but it is good if you want to go above 30th of a second and really start exploring incredibly long exposures. And some cameras have, I think, a C setting as well, which is also quite useful, where you press a shutter and it opens the lens, you can walk away, the lens is open, and it only closes when you go up to it and press it again. I think that's C setting. My recent camera hasn't had it, so I've lost track of that one a bit. So yeah, that's your basic settings for working in night photography, and it's all about the shutter speed, I would say. It's all about starting to go much slower shutter speeds and slower photographs, slower exposures than a second, and that's when you really pick up that subtle light. Aperture and ISO are something you can play with. It's good to know what they do, but it's really playing that shutter speed that's important when you're doing nighttime photography. Okay, we're going to go outside now and I'm going to show you how to do nighttime shots.
Okay, so we've seen some examples of my nighttime photography. We've looked at keeping that camera steady. We've looked at how to use manual settings to get a good exposure. I'm going to do the first shot now in this, which is my back alley outside my house. I'm going to basically just show you how a range of exposures slowly picks up more and more detail, slowly gets more and more light. So I'll bracket those from an exposure that looks close to how I see it with my eyes, so a little bit of detail, right through to it almost looking like daylight, like really bright, loads of light hitting it, and I'll talk you through the exposures I'm using to do that. A few other things about night photography. It's really good to let your eyes adjust. When I'm out doing night photography, I try and not look at my phone and try and not have torches too much, because there's all sorts of detail that once you get a bright light like this is probably a bad example, bright light shining at me, I'm missing all this detail in the world. So letting your eyes adjust is really, really important, because suddenly you'll see everything and you can work with your composition, you can decide good pictures because it's all there in front of you. So don't have a torch on too much, try and work with the darkness, try and use that. There's better times of year to do night photography. It's actually the summer now, kind of early August, so it gets dark quite late on really. Probably gets properly dark about 9:30, 10 o'clock. Luckily tonight is quite a cloudy night, so usually on a cloudy night the sunlight and the blue sky is cut out a lot earlier, so it might be darker now 45 minutes earlier than say if it was a really clear night when you'd still have a bit of blue in the sky. So different times of year can be useful with nighttime photography. Yeah, so we're going to have a look now at a range of exposures. I'm going to go to my camera, and we're not going to be able to film this at the same time because I'm going to be working with such long exposures that you won't be able to see it. So you're just going to hear me talking you through the exposures, and then I'll show you the still images as I work through them. So here we go. So I'm at my camera now, and I'm going to start working with different exposures to get some detail in this view. As I mentioned in the when we saw the info panel on manual settings, I said I'd set the ISO of about 500 because that is making the camera fairly sensitive to light and also not keeping quite a lot of detail as well. So 500 ISO is a good compromise. And then I'm going to go for an f-stop of f5, so I have a little bit of depth of field there, which is quite useful, but the aperture is quite wide, so that aperture is letting quite a lot of light in. So we're going to start with a quick exposure, and this will create an almost black image, I know that. So here we go. So this is a 60th of a second, and as you can see that's totally black. I'm now going to start pushing my exposure much longer, so I'm going to go for a 20th of a second. And there's still no detail, so this is a pretty boring tutorial so far. So we'll go 2.5 of a second, a quarter of a second, and now you're just starting to see a bit of detail. And we'll now go for 2 seconds because I'm feeling crazy. Okay, that's what I wanted to show. 2 seconds is really good. 2 seconds is the exposure I wanted to show you. This is how it looks in front of me now to my eyes. This is the amount of detail I can see with my eyes just by looking at it. And that is a 2 second exposure, f5 at ISO 500 of this back alley. Now we're going to start working our way through much longer exposures. We'll move to a 4 second exposure. And you can hear that lens open all this time, and there it closes. That's 4 seconds. Now let's have a look at that. If I hit play on my camera, loads of detail. It's starting to look brighter than my own eyes. Now we're going to go for a 10 second exposure, and the lens is open now, so it's soaking up all that light, all that little bit of light in front of me. It's just hitting the back of the lens, it's hitting the chip inside the camera that captured the light and recording all that detail. Now if we hit it, it's starting to really glow. It's starting to look incredibly bright, which is what I wanted to demonstrate, much brighter than it would in my own eyes. There's areas there in the greenery to the left where it just looks pitch black for me. And then we'll go even further, we'll push it to 20 seconds. So I know now there's going to be loads of detail all over. I'm just next to a big car park, so there's actually the lights of the car park hitting some of these trees and bushes. So there's quite a lot of detail from those lights. But then the shadow areas look very deep, very solid. So there's not much detail there. And a train went past at that exact moment, so there may be a nice blurred line. So that's starting to almost look like daylight, and we'll just do one more. We'll push it right up to 30, which I know is the longest exposure time I can set this camera to. And it'll be open a while. And it's actually, I don't know if you can hear it, but it's quite a windy night. So the trees are moving, the branches are moving, and in a 30-second exposure, and in even a 10-second exposure, that would create an interesting blur, interesting movements of the trees. They'll kind of have this, they won't be solid, they'll kind of look almost liquid-like, which is interesting. Photographing the sea is interesting at night because the waves almost just become this pale, pastel-y kind of flat area, and it looks really cool. It can look really strange and kind of ghostly. Okay, that was my 30-second exposure, and as you can see there, it's very, there's loads of detail there, way more than that original exposure. And at this point, you can see the colours are a bit strange in that. At this point I would urge you to think about your white balance a little bit. So I tend to, this is going into the slightly technical side of it, but I tend to always shoot with my camera on RAW settings. That means when you take a picture, what's remembered by the camera to the memory card, it's just the pure data that comes off the chip, the pure ones and zero, that there's no processing happened. So any white bounce I'm seeing isn't forever, isn't fixed. If I open it on my computer, then I can apply another white bounce. I can even move the exposure around. I've got all that detail to play with. If you shoot if you don't shoot it as RAW, if you shoot it as a JPEG or a TIFF and you have a white bounce, that white bounce tends to be fixed. So I usually shoot with my camera on auto white bounce, and then when I'm back at my computer I choose a white bounce. But you might want to get your white bounce correct while you're out and about, so you have a white bounce button or a WB button, and when you do the long exposures, just start experimenting, work through a few different white bounces, and you might find one works really well. You might find tungsten works great, you might find a kind of halogen light works good, you might find daylight works well. So just rotate through them and look, and there might be one that looks great when the colours are really not too red and warm, sometimes or not too cold. So just have a play with your white bounce. As you can see, this one's quite yellowy at the moment, but I'm going to just do a process on it. I'm going to do a white bounce treatment when I open it on my computer now, and you'll see it's much clearer, it's got much more kind of zinginess to it as I open it now, and that's by selecting a slightly different white bounce, which is pulling out different detail. Okay, on to the next demo that I'm going to show you. Okay, so the next demonstration I want to give you is about bracketing exposures at night. So when you do night photography, especially when you've got artificial light around, like these big lights that are on this supermarket car park, you often get a massive contrast between the brightness of the bulbs. They might be really sending out loads of light, so the area close to them is bleached white. But then when you've got shadow areas, there's a light on me at the moment as well, so you can't really see how deep those shadow areas are. Can be so black, there's no light hitting them at all. So it's really useful to bracket exposures to have a light exposure, or sorry, let's start to a dark exposure that looks good on the lights, the really brightest area, there's detail right next to the bulbs, and then a mid exposure where you have an average detail that does a reasonable job, and then a much longer, much brighter exposure which picks up all this detail in the shadow areas. And then in Photoshop you can blend those exposures together. I'm going to show you how I bracket images. We're going to show you some more stills on the camera now of this view, and then I'll do a very quick demo of how I then blend the detail together from 5 or 6 different images to make the most of this view. A quick tip, and this applies to daylight photography as well, it's useful at night but also in daytime. Sometimes if you look at a view and you squint, if you half close your eyes, then you suddenly, the light and the dark areas of the image really jump out at you. It works just as well in the daytime, but it kind of cuts out all the noise in the middle, all the kind of mid areas, the areas that are neither really bright or dark. It just gets it down to the brightest and darkest areas. So that helps you tune into what's really bright in an image. And also it helps you, I find it helps me with composition as well. I often squint before I'm going to take a picture because you see the basic shapes of an image, and that really helps you with the layout and the composition, so it helps you make things fit comfortably within an image. So it's useful at night in a shot like this, but try that in the daytime. Just squint at the view in front of you and it just breaks it right down to its purest forms, its boldest forms, I guess we're talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to quickly show you how I create a bracketed set of exposures of this view, and then we'll do a little bit of a demonstration in Photoshop of how I blend those exposures to get the best out of each one. Okay, so I'm back at my camera now, and I'm going to do my first exposure of this view here. I'm going to start at f5 and an ISO of 500 again, so that's the same f-stop and the same ISO as the previous shot of the back alley, and I'm going to do an exposure of 10 seconds. I know that this is going to be way too bright because I'm shooting a totally different scene to the previous night shot. This scene has got direct lights on it, so it's going to be achingly bright. If you have a look at that now, it's really bright. And think how in the previous set of exposures of the back alleyway, I was working with 30-second exposures and it wasn't as bright as that. So as soon as you get direct light in your night photographs, you need to start working at, you don't need such long exposures. You can kind of get down to like a second, 2 seconds and pick up enough detail. So 10 seconds is way too much. I'm going to find a nice starting point, we'll go for 2 seconds, see how that looks. And I'm just testing it at the moment, setting my manual exposure and seeing how it looks, and actually 2 seconds looks really good. But you can see the problem I'm talking about. The area near the light in the middle of the shot is really bright, there's not much detail near it, and the area of the tree and the grass in the foreground is really dark, and there's not much detail in that. So I like my exposure at f5 500 ISO at 2 seconds. I think that's a really good average exposure. But what I want, so I can get detail in that tree, I'm going to go to a 5-second exposure and take that now. And you can hear the lens open, and it's soaking up all that light from the view in front of me. And there you go, the lens closed. That's 5 seconds of light, and that's really bright. And we're starting to see some detail in that tree. Maybe not enough, so I'm going to go even brighter still. Let's go for a 10-second exposure. Actually, let's go for 13, just to make sure I'm totally covered. And all this time, the lens is open. Again, we're going to get a bit of nice blur because of that wind on the trees. But I probably won't use the leaves out of this image. I'll probably just use the area where that tree is, where the bark on that tree is, and maybe the grass in the foreground. And if we look at that, there's loads of detail if I need it. So now I'm going to go right back down to that 2-second exposure I like, which I've already taken. Then I'm going to go darker. So I'll go to a second, and I'll take a picture. We'll have a look at that. Now you're starting to see detail of the leaves right where that really bright light is. And now we'll go darker still. We'll go to 2.5 of a second, so a quarter of a second. And if we see it there, we've got all the darkness I need. I don't need any more detail than that. I know I've got it there. I know between that range of exposures, so from 2 seconds right up to the much longer exposures, right through to those quicker exposures, I can blend those together and create a version of that view that has a really nice range of details. It's a kind of technique that's very close to HDR, which stands for high dynamic range, where you're blending many images and capturing more of a range of detail than you would in a single photograph. But a lot of HDR is done automatically, but I tend to do it manually by painting in Photoshop, so it's a lot more subtle and I have a lot more control over it. So we're going to head to my computer now and I'll show how I put those images together.
So we're going to now look at how to bring those images together that I just took of the car park. We did the bracketed exposures and we're now looking at them in Photoshop. I'm going to do this fairly quickly, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because there's a standalone tutorial all about blending exposures. I've put a link to that below. So I'm going to do this fairly quickly without kind of breaking it down into the sections. And if you go to the link below and follow that, then you should get the theory and you should get the idea of how to work with layers and layer masks to blend these exposures. So we're looking at those 5 images in Photoshop. We've got the image in the middle that's larger here was the first exposure we took, which is 2 seconds. And then we're going lighter to the 5-second exposure, and then to the 13-second exposure, which is really bright. And then we'll come over here and we've got our 1-second exposure, and then we've got our 0.4 of a second exposure here, so which is a lot darker. So I'll select the center image, and then let's go for the lighter ones first. So I click on that and we go select all, and then edit and copy, and then we edit, paste that on top, and you can see the layer palette growing as these new layers get added. So now we're going to go for the lightest of the image, the 13-second exposures. Select all, and then we'll go copy and we'll paste that, and we go from having 2 layers to 3 layers. And now we'll go to the darker one, but not the darkest, the second to darkest. Select all, and then we go edit and copy, and we go to that center image again and paste it. And this last time I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts. So click on the darkest, I'm going to do Command A to select it all, Command C to copy it, and Command V to paste it on top. So I can now close all of these images that I've copied onto the center image. I know that they're in the right place now. So, and I can make this a little bit bigger. That looks great. And now, if I click down through the layers, you can see we've got our original image, the 2-second exposure, 5-second, 13-second, and then we're down to the 1-second, 0.4 of a second. Now, if I click on layer 4, the top one, and hold down the Alt key, and then at the bottom, click on the square with the circle in, create an all black layer mask that's attached to that layer. And because it's all black, it's telling Photoshop not to show anything of that layer. And if I work my way down, I can do the same thing. If I'm holding down the Alt key and create a layer mask, it makes all of that layer invisible. And that's great. So all of those top layers, those brighter and darker layers, are now totally invisible because we've got a black layer mask. But then if I find my toolbar, where's my toolbar? Oh, okay. Workspace, essentials, there it is. Let's just tidy all this up. Sorry about this. Okay, that's great. So there's my toolbar, and now we'll get a brush from there, and we'll make that brush white. So click on the top color there. It's a bit big at the moment. Maybe we'll make that a little bit smaller. So we'll make it about, maybe a bit bigger. Let's make it about 400 pixels. And now we'll go to the slightly brighter layer, and I can slowly paint white on my layer mask, and the areas that I paint that white on the layer mask, I'm telling Photoshop to make visible of the image that's that lighter exposure, so I can bring a bit more detail in here. And if we look at the layer mask, so put that in the middle here, just so I can show, you can see white is turning up on there, and every time I paint white on there, it brings through a little bit more detail at that brighter exposure. So we can bring through detail in the tree. And it's quite slightly weird detail because it's got a lot of that movement from the wind, but it's looking good. And now if I go to the really bright exposure, I can use that to bring out a little bit of shape in that tree. So I can bring out some of the bark and the textures in that, just carefully painting it through with a big brush and white on that brush. That's looking great. Don't want to go too far. That's probably about right. Okay, and then if I now go on the darker layer there, the darker exposure, sorry. So we're starting to move to the two darker exposures, and click on the layer mask. And then I can just bring through a bit of detail in that car park. And I can bring through, if you look at that light, let me do it in an exaggerated version. If we go to the very darkest layer and I get my brush at full opacity, I can do that and paint through loads of that dark exposure and bring through all that definition right next to that light. I don't really want to do that, so I'm going to click undo to get rid of that. But if I use the slightly darker layer and a lower opacity brush, I can just gently dab it through and bring through a little bit of detail, and then maybe even go to the darkest and we can get detail right next to it. So we brought through that extra detail. If I in one go close all those layers down, that's how it was. Now bringing those in gives us a bit of extra definition, which is quite useful. I've maybe gone a little bit too far on the lighter layers, so I can just turn the opacity of those layers down a little bit so it's not as noticeable, because it looks a little bit fake. So we'll just turn those down a little bit. The darker ones I think look okay, so that's it. We've blended an exposure, so we've got more of a range of details from the light area next to the lights in the car park. There's detail there, right through to more detail in this kind of shadow area at the bottom. So it's got more to look at. Okay, and then at the end of that, we just go flatten image, and all of those separate layers become one single image, as though it was just taken off the camera. And that's how you blend layers, which is really useful on night photography, because you get that massive range of brightness within the shot, right from next to a bulb, particularly if you've got artificial light or the moon, to shadow areas, which tend to be really, really solid.
Okay, so a quick demo in daylight so you can see what I'm doing here. I've mentioned that nighttime and low light photography is all about long exposures. That's having the lens of the camera open for a long amount of time, soaking up a lot of light, so you get a much brighter image than you can see with your own eyes. A really important part of that is keeping your camera as still as possible. Any slight movement on your camera over a 1 second exposure or 10-second exposure, lights will blur, the image will become fuzzy, or lose that kind of sharpness. So really good use of a tripod is very important. So I'm going to quickly show you how to use a tripod really well. And then also I'm going to show you another technique about how to kind of wedge your camera and, sorry about the train, and keep the position of the camera, even if you haven't got a tripod, how to keep that position fixed. So this is a tripod. A lot of this is fairly self-explanatory, but sometimes I do talks and I see people struggling a bit or not using it to its best effect. So I just want to quickly go through that. Number one, and this is a thing that I've missed, and this is learning from my experience, is to make sure that your tripod plate is really well secured. So you can use a screwdriver or you can use a coin to attach this metal plate at the bottom of the camera. You can see that. It's really important that that is really well secured and won't shift at all. It's not such a problem if your camera is shooting landscape like that, but as soon as you put it sideways, if that's loose, it can pivot slightly. The weight of the lens can make the camera tip forward a little bit, and all of your images have a very slight blur. All the lights will blur slightly because it's slowly tipping. And the really annoying thing about it is might not notice it. It's just a very slight movement, like hardly anything. You'd obviously not look at it and see it happening, otherwise you would jump on it straight away and realize it was a problem. So always make sure that screw on the bottom is incredibly tight. Now we're going to look at the tripod. So you have a way of securing it to the tripod head. If you clip that in, and again make sure that's nice and secured. Tripod has 3 legs, so let's make those go a little bit longer. Okay, so here's a thing that sounds really obvious, but I've seen people make this mistake. So just to cover it, sometimes people will not put the legs out properly. It always makes me very anxious when I see it, because I can just imagine the camera tipping over in the wind. Sometimes people will be like that, or even and not realize that the real strength in a tripod lies in the fact that you've got them locked out at their fullest, and that's where you get that real strength. You've got that good strong base. Another thing that's really important with a tripod is where the legs stand. So as soon as you're stood on grass or soft ground or mud, there's always going to be a little bit of wobble to it. It's not going to be as secure as solid ground. So always, if you can, it's not always possible, always try and get it on something solid, even if it's not all 3 legs. If you can get 2 legs on a stone or a rock, then that's going to be more solid than everything on mud. Or even if you can just get 1 leg on a tiny bit of stone that you know is very fixed and solid, then you know it's going to be as good as possible. 3 legs, but also a tripod often has this extra bit here, almost like a monopod extension, which gains you a foot. That can be really useful, and I use it quite a lot, but you have to be aware that as soon as you're using that, there's a lot more opportunity for that camera to move. That is really solid to that point, but as soon as you get there, you've just got 1 column. So just be aware when you're using that you have to be really careful with everything else. Your shutter speeds might have to be a little bit slower. You might have to be very careful not to nudge it. You might have to be very aware of what the wind's doing. So use that extra column, but use it carefully. Another very important thing is, once you've got your camera position and you've moved it around, you've swiveled it, you've got it straight, you've tipped it forward, always then make sure everything is locked off really firmly. And I mean everything. Sometimes you can forget about that and it wobbles. You can not. And it just means, if you've got it like that, it's going to be as still as possible, and you're helping yourself out. You're making your life easier, and there's not going to be any motion blur there. So yeah, they're the basics of using a tripod. Make sure it's on solid ground, make sure everything's locked off. Try not to use this bit too much, and if you do, be very careful. Now we're going to have a look at a little shortcut technique when you haven't got a tripod with you. I'm going to show you how to use other things you might have hold of to keep your camera lovely and still and do long exposures. So sometimes you can be traveling and you might not be able to have a tripod with you for various reasons. I'm just going to show you a picture here of Grand Central Station, Grand Central Terminal in New York. This isn't the kind of place you can walk in there with a tripod, so you have to figure out ways of securing your camera, keeping it good and steady to do a long exposure. You can see the people blurring here, so that's a 1-second exposure. So to do that, I had to be fairly clever and get my camera in there, and then use my wallet as a wedge almost. So you can, as long as you put lots of weight on your camera, you can do a 1-second exposure. So let's just do that. Ooh. Okay. If you put loads of weight on your camera, keep it steady as still, watch the camera, you might even see it moving, then you can hold it and do a 1-second exposure. If you've got a base, if you've got something to lean it on or a wall, you can start using longer exposures and start capturing a lot of light even though you haven't got a tripod. But obviously if you're keeping the base flat against whatever's there, the top of a wall, if you're holding it against a wall like that, the angle, you're quite restricted on angles. That's where something like the wallet in your pocket might come in useful. So you can suddenly wedge the wallet underneath, put your weight on, and suddenly do a 1-second exposure pointing up a bit. You can do the opposite to that. You can wedge your wallet at the back as well and keep the lens right on the edge like that. Obviously you don't just need a wallet, but anything fairly solid you've got with you. Your mobile, but that really doesn't lift it that much, but you might be able to use a couple of mobile phones or something like that if you borrow one off someone. But suddenly you've got the ability to have your camera at that angle, so you're shooting up, you can let it go, put it behind, and you can be shooting down, and it just gives you so much control in a way that I mean obviously a tripod would be easier and better, but sometimes you can't get a tripod in places that are either high security, or this image here, for example, I was traveling in China and Australia. I was doing a 2-month road trip and I didn't want to take a tripod all that time because it can be a real heavy thing to carry every day. So I did the same thing. I used a wallet. I wedged the camera against the window frame. I think I even used the swing of the window to get different angles because I was pointing the camera up, down, like a panoramic, so I could get all these different angles. And that kind of creative use of a wedge or using whatever you've got in your surroundings to hold it as still as possible means you can suddenly, without a tripod, be getting 5-10 second exposures. As long as you put that weight on the camera, you keep it as still as possible, you keep it really steady, and suddenly you've got a device that can do long exposures without a tripod. So I wanted to bring this one on location. We're right on the edge of Lyme Park. The other side of that wall is Lyme Park, and I was there earlier in the week and I saw this amazing view of Manchester in the background. So I'm going to show you a really nice version of night photography. We're going to do some bracketing because I want to try and get that detail of the city and also this lovely detail of all the bracken and the trees around me. So I'm going to try and blend that. But before we get going on that, I just want to tell you a little bit about something that's quite important with night photography, and that's the sort of ratio of daylight. There's still a little bit of daylight in the sky. It looks quite dark to my eyes, but you have to wait for it to get really black, really dark before you really get to that kind of, till that point where the city really, really glows. So before I shoot the elements to do this panoramic image and this bracketed image, I'm just going to show you how the ratio slowly changes from the point here where there's still just a bit of daylight, a bit of light in the sky, as you can see, but then slowly over the next sort of 20 minutes that's going to cut out and you get the city's really going to start to glow, really going to start to radiate. So I'll show you a quick time lapse of that. So you can see here through a series of time-lapse photographs, photograph roughly every 4 seconds, that the ratio of light from the city, which at the start is kind of bright, but it's maybe not the brightest thing in the image. The gaps in the sky are perhaps a little bit brighter. But as the sky goes darker, because the sun's getting further around the earth, so creating less light on the sky that's above me now, I'm slowly also adjusting the exposure. So the overall image feels a sort of similar brightness, but you'll notice the sky's going darker. But every time I adjust the exposure, the city glows more and looks brighter. So obviously this narration isn't real time, but you can see it all changing as it sort of glimmers in front of me. That ratio of light's really changed now. There's light in the sky that you can still see, but it's much more lit by the city, and a lot of the light in that view in front of us is due to artificial light, whereas when we started this animation, a majority of the light was coming from the sky, the remainder of the daylight. So we're going to stop that time lapse now, and we're just going to quickly move back through it very, very quickly, right back to the first point there, and now we'll come right back to this point here where it's nice and dark, just so you can see that effect extra sped up, so you can see it drop from dark, the city glowing, to the other extreme, which is the sky glowing and not that much light in the city. And we'll come back to this, and this is how it looks at the moment. Okay, so we've just looked at that ratio change from daylight lighting it most to the city lighting the view most. So now we've got that artificial light is lighting the glow. So hopefully that animation demonstrates that. Now we're going to look at how we actually take this photograph. We're going to look at bracketing here. We're going to look at using a range of exposures to capture the detail we want. So I always like to try and explain the problem, and then I'll talk to you about the solution. So the problem is that city is glowing really, really brightly in the image, and maybe there's some detail in the sky, but then this foreground area here, if I didn't have that light on there that's dazzling me at the moment, would have no detail at all. So how do we get that detail, and how do we make sure we don't lose all that detail in the city lose that real brightness in the city. So to do that, we're going to use a range of exposures from light to dark, similar to how we did at home of the car park, but it's just a much nicer view here. So we should be able to capture much more interesting detail. So I'm going to turn that light off and I'm going to come to camera and we're going to see a series of stills. And again, we're going to go back in my studio and I'll show how I'll layer those up to capture all that lovely detail that's there, but we can't quite see it all in one shot. Okay. Okay, so we're back at the camera now and we're going to look at how to get this range of exposures to capture that really nice detail that's in this image. I'm going to go for a slightly wider aperture. I'm going to go for 2.8, otherwise the exposures are going to be so long. And I'm going to push my ISO to 800 as well, just so you're not sitting here waiting for long exposures to happen, which would be quite boring. So I've changed those and I'm going to go to 2 seconds and we'll see how that's looking. Okay, that's way too bright. So actually, I think that's a really good mid exposure. That's a good starting point. So that's f2.8, an ISO of 800 and 2 seconds. So I think that's pretty good, but the city's a bit too bright. So I'm going to go for a slower shutter speed of, let's go for a second and see how that looks. That's okay. It could go a bit darker still. So we'll close down to half a second. Okay, that's dark enough. I might never use that shot, but it's useful to have. And we know 2 seconds with our mid exposure, so we'll go lighter from that. We'll go for 4 seconds. And now you should start seeing loads of detail in the sky. I still don't think we'll see much detail in this foreground area because there's not a lot there. Let's go even brighter still. 10. It's going to be that long exposure, so you're all sitting here waiting in anticipation. But it will get there. Yeah, just have to be patient. Okay, now let's see that. Okay, you're just starting to see an edge of detail in that foreground there. I'm going to push my ISO up a little bit higher, just so we're not waiting for ages here. I'm going to go for a 20-second exposure at an ISO of 1000, and well, 20 seconds is slowly playing out. There's a plane moving in front of me and bats flying around. It's all very beautiful. I can hear a stream over there. I don't know if you can pick that up. You probably can't. That's the sound of the landscape. There's your 20-second exposure. Okay, that's good. We're starting to see detail in the foreground. That's looking great. But as you can see, to get that detail in the foreground, the sky is incredibly bright. The city is incredibly bright. That glow is really happening. I'm just going to go brighter still. So I'm going to go for a 30-second exposure. And this is just to get loads of detail in that foreground area, so we should see shape there. It might start creating a slightly weird effects where the trees are. That's something I can deal with when I'm back in the studio, but hopefully we should capture a lot of detail. And that detail, the light that's hitting that foreground area, is a tiny bit of the daylight, but also is the reflected light from the city. So that city light bouncing off the clouds, just hitting the greenery that's around me. And it's so dark, it soaks up all that light. But we're using that 30-second exposure and suddenly there's loads of detail there. And that's just that reflected light from the city. So yeah, I'm going to go back to the studio now and I'm going to put these images together and I'll show you how I blend them to get that lovely range of detail between those very contrasting exposures, that brightness of the city and that real darkness of the foliage that's right in front of me. So I've opened those exposures of Lyme Park into Photoshop and arranged them so I've got a little bit of order to them. So we've got our first exposure there, that's the 2-second exposure, then the darker ones, 1 second, half a second. Then over here we've got our lighter exposures, so we've got the 4 second, the 10 seconds, the 20 seconds and the 30 seconds. I'm going to blend them together and it's the same technique as I did in the car park, so I'm going to move fairly quick and I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts. But just a quick reminder that there is a link below to a much more detailed explanation of how to bracket and blend your bracketed exposures in Photoshop. There's a whole standalone tutorial. But I just really wanted to show this one as well because I want it to be a bit more precise and it's a bit more of a nice image than the car park one. So let's bring these images in. We'll go for the darker ones first. So all, select all, copy, and then we can close that and then we can paste it and then select all on the darkest one, copy, close it and paste it, and then you can see our layer palette over here slowly growing. We'll go for the 4 second one, a bit lighter, and we'll paste that on top, and then the 10 second one, and then the 20-second one, and then the really bright one, which is the 30-second one, plus the ISO's been bumped up a little bit, so it's even brighter still, almost like daylight. So we have all our images stacked on top of each other. If I close the eyes, you can see all the way back to that first one. Now, if I create my all black layer masks, so we'll start on the top, and we click the square of the circle in whilst holding down the Option key, and you get a black layer mask. We'll do that, so we're making all of the layers that have the black layer mask next to them invisible. I'm telling Photoshop not to show anything on those layers, which means if I then go over here to my toolbar, and if I get the brush tool, and I make sure it's white, then let's go for a really extreme example. I can paint through all that detail from that really bright exposure, from that 30-second exposure. But I don't want to go that far. That would be way too dramatic. It's a bit, Photoshop's about lots of tiny subtle moves, not about big dramatic moves. So I can use my darker exposure, my 1 second exposure, just to edge in a little bit of detail in the city in the distance, take some of that brightness out of the clouds. And like I said, I want to be a bit more precise on this one, so I zoom right in. We can take some of that brightness out of the distant city, just so you see detail, so it's not just a pure bleached out brightness. And we've also got an even darker still exposure, so I can go right into these buildings here and use that really dark exposure, and I can just give them a tiny bit more shape. Not going too far, like I say, it's all about subtle moves. Now we're going to start brightening up this foreground area, so I'm going to get a bigger brush. Let me get my brush at about, let's see, we'll go about, that'll do, no, too big, let's go for just over 1,000. There we go. Now, here we are. And now we'll make that a bit bigger, and we can slowly use that white brush to paint in some detail of the trees. Then we'll go to an even brighter exposure, and we can bring in some detail over here. And it's subtle to start with, you can't see too much, but it's slowly building up, it's slowly blending in exposure. And I could probably lose a little bit of that darkness in the sky as well, that darkness in the corners. So we just go like, oh, too far. We'll just edge it out at low opacity, just to kind of balance it a little bit more. And then I'm going to go to an even brighter exposure still, and I'll just bring in a bit more detail, bring in some of that dry stone wall. Again, just sort of being subtle. I'm pressing the number keys on the keyboard, and each time I do that, it changes my opacity. So if I press 90, it does a big difference. But then if I press 10, it just does a subtle difference. So I'm always just touching the keys, slowly working my way between the exposures. I know that this is one of the main things I wanted to show you on this one. I know that there's a very subtle area to blend around about here. So I want some of these lighter exposures bringing detail to the trees there, but I don't want the city to suddenly become brighter with those exposures. If I wasn't paying much attention, I could do that and the city becomes really bright. So I'll go a smaller brush, I'll go zoom in a little bit more, that's probably about right, and I'll go for just a 10% or 20% opacity, and you can just slowly, actually it's a bit bright, 10% opacity, and you can just suggest it, you can just slowly suggest that detail, bring it in slightly, hardly anything, and it just blends nicely. So it's not, you're not getting a really bright city, you're just getting a really nice kind of handover between exposures. Now zoom out, that's looking okay, and let's see my layer palette. Maybe we'll bring in a bit of detail from the brightest just to show how that works. So got a nice big brush, and we can just bring a bit of detail through in those real shadow areas. I'm just going to put my opacity, ooh, really bright there, so I'll put my opacity right down. And there we go, very, very quickly done, because I don't really want to spend ages looking at this, because we've looked at it before and there's a whole tutorial devoted to blending and bracketing exposures, link below. But I hope that's useful. And the last things you do is flatten the image. So if we go to, in the layer palette, in the top right corner, there's 4 straight lines. If you click on that and go to flatten image, all that separate layer information just becomes one flat image, like it's straight off the camera. Suddenly you've got a photograph, and you can use the curves across the whole thing. You can do things like play with the hue and saturation across the whole image and get some nice feel into it, because it's all been flattened, it's all become one flat layer. So yeah, I hope that's useful, and I'm going to move on with the tutorial. Okay, so we're up on a bridge over the M62, the road that runs between Manchester and Leeds. It's about 1 in the morning, but it's a lovely warm night, so it's really nice out here. I just wanted to show another thing that's quite useful when it comes to low light photography, night photography, basically photography where you've got to use long exposures. When you're photographing cities and buildings, they stay static, obviously. So the long exposures, you don't see any movement. But suddenly when you've got roads or planes or people, you can suddenly start working with blurs and kind of motion blur within the image, let the objects move within the image over that 1 second exposure, over that 10-second exposure. So I thought I'd come up here on the Motorway bridge and just show how you can work with those blurs to get the lights of the cars kind of tracking through the images. And then also I'm going to show a quick trick in Photoshop about how to blend them so you can have about 5 or 6 shots, maybe 20 shots together, and you can continue those blurs and they can really fill the image. So we're going to now swap away from this video you're looking at, and we're going to get to some stills, and I'll get that set up, get a good exposure, and then I'll get some of these nice motion blurs that are in front of me. I apologise if the noise is a bit weird here, there's lots of traffic around, but yeah, hopefully you can hear me. So here we go, over to stills. Okay then, so we're going to do the still photographs from the bridge now. I'm going to, as before, select my exposure that I like of the view, and I'm just going to look at the back of the camera and make a judgment on that. So I'm going to start with a ISO of 500 again, and maybe we'll go for a f-stop of 6.3 because it's quite a bright view. So 6.3 is a slightly more closed aperture, f6.3, but it doesn't let quite as much light in, but that's okay because this is a very bright view. And we'll try 2 seconds to start with. And how's that looking? That's looking not bad, but a little bit bright. We'll drop it down to a second and see how that's looking. And that's great. That's the kind of detail I want. It's not too bright on the road. The headlights aren't going to flare things out too much. That looks brilliant. I'm going to also bracket this exposure. So before I get going on the motion blur, I'm going to push my exposure to 4 seconds just to get some of that detail in the sky beyond, and that's looking great. And I'm going to go even further. I'm going to go for a 10-second exposure just to get as much detail as I can in that sky. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so there's lots of detail in the sky, and that might be useful later. So I'm going to drop right back down to that exposure I like of a second, and I'm just going to put it on continuous shooting. So as long as I hold the shutter down, it's just going to keep taking photographs, and I'm just going to wait for it to get busy. And here we go, lots of cars coming towards me. So I'm just holding my finger on the shutter, and it's taking 1 second exposure, 1 second exposure. And that gives those cars a lovely chance to move, and we're getting some really nice blur in the headlights as they come towards us. And now we're getting some vehicles coming the other way. And we're getting all that light coming from the right-hand side, which is looking great. So as you can see, they're nice blurred exposures. We'll zoom in a little bit now and just pause it on one of those. And that's looking really good. And now I'm going to pause for a second. I'm just going to wait for more cars to come in on the left-hand side. So let me just stop for a second. Okay, so here comes some traffic on the left-hand side, and I'm just shooting, letting the cars pass through, and that will capture those lovely red lights, and hopefully we'll get some overtaking so some of the other lanes get used. There goes a truck, another vehicle, and in a second we're going to have loads more, so we'll create a nice sort of river of red on that left-hand side. And maybe we'll just wait for a couple more. And what I'm going to do is, when I'm back at my studio, I'm going to show how you can put a lot of these images together. So you create a kind of extended tracks. You make those slight blurs that last a second into an entire run of red going through the image by blending the brightest bits of each image. So we'll get these lovely kind of rivers of red going through the image. And I'm also going to have a quick look at how to create time-lapse animation of this view as well. Some very early skills, very quick skills on using After Effects, which I use to do really nice animated footage as well. So we'll be turning what I'm shooting here, all the different stills, into a lovely, nice, smooth kind of animation of this motorway as well. So I'm going to keep shooting. We've got some more cars going away from me in a second. And here they come. And your camera should be able to keep shooting. Sometimes your memory card can't keep up with the shots it's taking. But modern cameras have pretty quick memory cards these days, or you can buy quick memory cards. So you can usually just keep going and keep creating shot after shot and create this lovely animated footage and these lovely kind of blended, blurred images. So this is me just creating a big library of images, which I'm going to play with in different ways, mess around with time, start playing with animation with these still photographs I'm taking now. And that's it. I think there's no more cars for now, so we'll call it a day and we'll head back to the studio and I'll show you how I put those together. Okay, so we're going to look in Photoshop at how to make the most of those motorway photographs we just took, how we can blend them together to create a real kind of river of light. So the first thing I'm going to do is blend the bracketed exposures that I did at the start. So this is the original exposure that I liked, my mid exposure. Now I'm going to add a dark one on top, a lighter one for that sky in the distance, and an even lighter one for that sky that's a long way away. And then, as before, we'll hold down the Option key and close these layer masks. I'll do this bit quick because we've shown this a few times now. I want to move on to the new effect that we've got that's really cool. So, if I now use a white brush on that black layer mask, I can bring through a little bit more nice detail in that sky and just have it glowing a bit. Then an even brighter one right for that horizon point. That looks pretty good. And then I might even darken off some of the areas using this darker exposure, so make it so that there's not quite as much light sort of radiating beyond the motorway. So yeah, that looks good. We've got a kind of more balanced exposure now, maybe taking a bit of heat out of some of those lights. Okay, now I'm going to introduce all the different shots of the cars shooting by, and I'm going to show you how we can blend them so they all appear in one photograph. So I'm not going to do all the images I took because there's 162 in total. I'm just going to try 45 to start with, otherwise we'll be watching for an awfully long time, which wouldn't be much fun. It's quite cool watching them open. You can see here the cars moving, it's almost like an animation in its own right as each individual shot of the motorway kind of opens in front of us. So pretty soon all 45 images will be open. And I just need to find my original show windows. Which one do I want? That one. So I just need to see this one first, which is the one I blended, so the one that's got those separate layers. I'm going to flatten it so to get rid of those different exposures, and now I'm going to start bringing in the cars in different positions. So if I go select all and then edit, copy, and now we'll paste that onto the one where I've added the sky and close that, and now the same on this. So select all and then edit, copy, and this is where those cars are slowly moving in front of us. So I'll just do one more where I talk you through it, and then I'll move to keyboard shortcuts. So select all, and that's selecting the cars in that next position, and then we go copy and then paste. Okay, now I'm going to go to keyboard shortcuts. So it's select all as Command A, Command C for copy, Command W for close, and then paste. Select all, copy, close, paste. Select all, copy, close, paste. Select all, copy, close, paste. Copy, close, paste. Select all, copy, close, paste. And now we're going to do one of those bits where it goes into fast forward, because you don't want to sit here watching me do this. So here we go. Okay, so we're back to normal speed, and we now have the most full layer palette that I've shown you during these tutorials. We've got all of those separate exposures of the cards in different positions. So if I click on the eyes on these, we slowly work our way back, and you can see the cards kind of moving through the image almost like an animation. What we're going to be looking at is something called blending modes, and blending modes are really clever. I use them quite a lot, particularly for when you want to kind of blend light from different light sources. So they're in your layer palette, so let's get layer palette central, and you've got lots here. As soon as you click on that where it says normal at the top of your layer palette, you've got all these options, and they do lots of strange things. Sometimes they do really odd effects, make it really moody and kind of slightly strange. But then the ones I tend to use the most are just up from halfway up, which is lighting and screen. So screen can be really good if you've got an all black view, but that won't be much good here because everything will just get really bright. But lighten's really good. Lighten, each blending mode does a different thing. It's like an algorithm that you're telling Photoshop to use a certain algorithm in how these two images interact. So how the image there interacts with the image below it. I'm not quite sure in detail how it works, but I just know that if you click on lighten, the algorithm it's telling Photoshop is to only show pixels of the top layer, this layer here, that are brighter than the layer below. So only show the lighter pixels, don't show anything else. So where you've got darker pixels in that layer, it just ignores them. Where you've got pixels that are about the same, so all this layer around there, it ignores them. But any picture any bit of that picture where the pixels are brighter, I'm telling Photoshop to show it. So what does that mean? So all the pixels that are brighter are the cars in that new position. I think you can just about see that there. And now if I go to the layer underneath and we go to lighten, we now got two layers with lighten, so they're brightening up that layer. And if we slowly work our way down, putting the blending mode to lighten, then you just get, of every layer that I'm putting my blending mode to lighten on, all you get are the pixels that are making the image that's underneath it lighter. So any other pixels are being ignored. So effectively, lighten, we're just bringing in those headlights, the bits where that brightness moves into the image. And you can see there, if I move that out of the way a little bit, and we keep going to lighten and working our way down. Now some of those red cars are coming in, and you can see we're seeing all those images at the same time, but not every single bit of detail of those images. All we're seeing is the light bits from each of those images. So you can see it's slowly turning into a river of light. And because I have my camera on a tripod and I was careful not to move it or judder it around, all the elements are staying roughly in the same place. So all the street signs, all the lamps are roughly in the same place, so everything looks really still, but all that's moving is that brightness of the car headlights as it moves through the shots. You can do something here. I've been going through it layer by layer, but you can mass select. So let me select to load. If you hold down the shift key, you can select, there's about 20 layers selected at once there, and then you can go to your blending mode, and this will be when you notice the biggest change, and click lighten there. Let me just, if we go to normal it's there, but if we go to lighten, all of those layers brightening up the image, and you suddenly got this sea of light, and that's the light information from 45 different exposures all coming together in the same shot. Just one last technique which I wanted to show you. At the moment there's going to be light from all those layers that's spilling onto the hills and creating a little bit of confusion. If I select all those layers and click on the folder at the bottom of the layer palette, it chucks them all into one folder. So they're all still there, they're all still on that lighten setting, so they're all still having that nice lighten effect on the image. But I can then create a layer mask on that, so I can, if I click on the option key, I can create a black layer mask, so you can't see anything at all. I can get myself a nice big white brush, put that opacity to 100%, and then I can do a nice job painting that brightness through, so we can have that lovely brightness coming through the image right across it, and it's not affecting any other parts of the image, it's only creating that sort of sea of light there that's, so it's not spilling too much light on the hills around, so it's keeping it a bit more tight and a bit more kind of bold and nice. So that's good. I think that's looking really nice. You can see there all that brightness from all those separate exposures is coming in really well. There's some really lovely details as we go in close here, the way it sort of interacts with that sign. I'm going to flatten that again, because sometimes you do all this post-production, all this layering, but then right at the end it's really nice to treat it like it was just a single photograph from the camera. So as long as it's flattened, I can go select all, and then free transform. Where's that free transform? Brain, where are you? Sorry about this. Free transform, sorry. And now if I hold down the command key, I can readjust the perspective, give it a nice bit of shape. Maybe, there we go. There's things like, I think that sign there is just a bit kind of normal looking. The rest of the image looks so pure and bright and bold. I can use the patch tool, the healing brush, sorry. I forget what all these tools are called. I just use keyboard shortcuts, so I do apologise if I rattle through it a bit quick. So I'm going to use the healing brush to, if you select the healing brush, which is the bottom of the toolbar there, and then make it about the right sort of size, quite small, and then if you hold down the option key, it creates a target, and then you click and it takes that target from a place, and then you can move some of that detail across. And because it's a healing brush, it blends it really nicely, and we can just make it a little bit more of a purer version of itself. I might even crop that a little bit because there's detail there that we don't really need, so let's crop in, get that looking really nice and sharp and bold. That's great. And now I'm going to just start bringing in some nice colours, so I might even enhance that blue there. So I'm just using a lassoed selection on that area. I don't know if you can see that line. And now we'll go select and modify feather, make that quite big, and now I can use my curves to really enhance that blue, make it even bolder and more kind of illustrative, I guess. And we can do the same on this red over here. We can make this a nice patch of red. So I've done a lasso tool there. I'm going to select and where are you? Feather, and we'll feather it nice and softly. And then I'm going to do my curves. So adjustment layers, adjustments, curves, and then we can put in a load more red to that, and maybe it could look better with a bit more contrast. So there we go, give that a nice bit of kind of moodiness and contrast. Deselect that. There you go, it's a nice kind of vivid, punchy image of the motorway created from all those separate exposures. I'm just going to quickly darken off these front areas just so it has a nice sort of feel to it. So modify feather again. I just take a little bit of brightness out of these foreground areas. But yeah, that's it. That's maybe about 50 exposures joined together. And to start with, we brought a bit of that detail from the sky in, and then the motorway. I'm just going to use my curves overall now. So I'll select, so image adjustment and curves. A lot of people use levels or brightness and contrast, but I love to use curves because I could just really get a sense of what it's doing to the image. I'm just going to take the, let's have a look. I've got some of it selected. So adjustment, curves, curves, and I'll just make that all a bit darker, a bit brighter, and maybe inject a bit of kind of cold blueness to it to bring out that horizon. And there we go. We've got quite a cool, punchy image of a motorway. It's got a nice kind of sharpness to it, a real nice energy of these cars kind of pounding through. Now you can just save that once it's all finished and flattened. So yeah, we're going to move on now to how we do a very similar thing but in After Effects. Okay, so we're now looking at After Effects, a different piece of software made by the same company, made by Adobe, made by the same people that make Photoshop, but this is a video editing software. But it's very, very similar to Photoshop. I picked this up really quickly because a lot of the same ideas you use in Photoshop about effects, about transforming the image, transforming the brightness, so much of that applies to After Effects, except you've got a timeline. So these effects happen over time. You create keyframes on the timeline, and that's what gives you this nice control, and you can create really amazing imagery. And it really ties in with photography. If you know how to shoot images, then and know how to work in Photoshop, then it's not a great leap to start bringing those images into After Effects. So I am going to show you how to do that, just give you a quick demo. This isn't going to be the most detailed tutorial, because to really go into this in fine detail would probably take like an hour's worth, but I just want to kind of move through it quickly, and I'll do a more detailed After Effects tutorial at a different time. So here's After Effects, and here's a folder of prepared images. If you create stills from a camera, so these are exactly the same images that we used in the last demo in Photoshop, but we're going to bring them into After Effects. So as long as these stills are labelled as they were off the camera, so in consecutive order, 446, 447, 448, 449, and it goes all the way down, there's about 160 images there. As long as they're labelled in that order and you haven't got any gaps, then you can drag that entire folder into After Effects, into your project menu there, and there it is. That's dropped in. But that's not just one image. If we now bring that to the bottom of the project panel, there's a thing that makes it into a composite. If you drop it into there, then suddenly all those images that were in a folder but then I dragged into After Effects, and now an animation, so if I hit spacebar, you can see them all moving through the image. All those separate clicks of the camera that you saw me taking, or you heard me taking and I talked about, and now an animation. And it's exactly the same images I was working with in Photoshop, but I'm using them now to create an animation. So we haven't done much work on that yet. At the moment, we've created a very short bit of footage. It's 5 seconds long, but as you can see, it moves incredibly quickly. It's absolutely rattling through those 5 seconds, and the cars are moving by really quickly. We're not making the most of the footage, so I'm going to show you some very quick ways of working in After Effects to make the most of your footage and to have some quite nice creative control over it. So let me just pause that. At the moment, that footage is, every frame is a different photograph. So we have, I think we're at 20, how many frames a second are we working with here? Composition settings, 30 frames a second. So in a second, we're cramming in 30 photographs. So we rattle through those 160 odd photographs really quickly, because we're getting through them a photograph every frame. But you can slow it down a little bit. We could slow it down to maybe 15 seconds, and the frames won't happen so quick. They won't happen on each individual, the photographs won't be shown on every single frame, but it will still look like smooth footage. So let me give you a quick talk through of how to do that. So if we click on the footage we want to change the time of, which is in the timeline at the bottom here. So this is your timeline, there's your footage. That's almost like a layer in Photoshop, you've got the eye on it. But what's different to Photoshop is you've got this bar here, which is time happening. That's what's different. But if I click on that, which is like my layer in photograph in Photoshop, you've got all things like you would in Photoshop. You've got effects, you can change the colors, you can transform the image, you can do loads of the things you do in Photoshop. But the thing you can't do in Photoshop is play with time. So if we go in time, you can rework time in many ways, but a simple way is using something called time stretch. If we go on that, you can see we've got that 5.8 seconds of footage at 100, and at 100% it's 5.8 seconds. I want to stretch that to, let's go 16 seconds. So that's stretching that footage by about 300%. And now if I hit OK at 16 seconds, now if I go forward a frame, so I'm going frame forward, frame forward, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So every 3 frames a new photograph's being shown. So it's slowing down already. I'm just going to increase my comp, which is the timeline I'm working with, is still only 5 seconds long. So I'm going to increase the length of time that composition is on. So I'm going to go to composition settings. I'm going to move that up to this 16 seconds that we know the footage is at. Okay, so now that footage is stretched over 16 seconds. So it'll go a little bit slower, but still look fairly smooth and still look pretty good. Let me just go. So there you go. It's maybe a little bit jumpy, but I'll just show you a very cool technique for losing that jumpiness. So if we zoom into our timeline, and there is that footage. If we now go edit, copy, and now edit, paste, we've now got that same footage twice on top of itself. And now if you go paste again, now we go paste again, that identical footage is stacked on top of itself. You won't actually see any difference at the moment, because all we're seeing is the top bit of footage. It's not allowing us to see below. But what I want to show is you can create time delays within your footage. So if we offset this footage along our timeline, so if each clip starts slightly later than the other, so we're moving it along the timeline, so this top clip, which I've moved to this point here, starts a few frames later than this first clip, and they all kind of stagger. And if we change the opacity of that top clip, and we put that to maybe quite a low opacity, about 11%, and then the next clip down, we put that to maybe 20% opacity, and then the next one. This will all make sense in a second. It just smooths out that footage, what we're doing here, and I'll show you why it's doing that. So that next layer is 30% opacity. This next one will go for a bit brighter, 55% opacity. So you're still seeing through these layers, but you're seeing bits of detail of the layers. So we'll go for about 62. Now, if we zoom in on our footage, so let's make it 100%, and maybe we'll go for a point in the middle where there's more cars around. If I hit space, what it's doing, because we've time delayed that footage, you're getting all these in-between frames, all these I think you call it tweening in animation, where you get these kind of gaps between frames suddenly have detail on. So you can see this car, if you watch this car moving towards us here, you've got the point where that frame moves and then the other frames slowly fade in behind it. So you can see it's got this nice kind of smoothness to it that it didn't have. And if I hit spacebar now and we see that animated, suddenly it looks a lot sort of softer and smoother and sort of more sympathetic. And if I go back and we see that a bit quicker, it's got this lovely kind of flow to it. So we're stretching our footage out now. We've turned that 5 seconds into a really nice smooth 15 seconds that is a little bit less frantic. You can kind of look at the cars a little bit more in a more interesting way. Okay, so that's one way of increasing the length of our footage. Once you're happy with a composite, you need to render it. So at the moment, we've just got that in After Effects and we're seeing like an approximation of what the footage will look like. But if you want to actually turn that into finished footage that you can share online or make part of a bigger video composition, you need to render it. So there's a few ways of doing that, but the way I like the most is to use the media encoder. So if you go to export and go add to media encoder queue. So this is media encoder and it's basically like the rendering engine. So you set After Effects up to have all these different moves, to have all these different fades and different things. But when you're watching it in After Effects, it's calculating each frame individually. So you need to render that. You need to turn that into just a flat film, all that. And when you're really going through it in After Effects, you can have 100 layers, all interacting, all lighting each other in different ways. But you need to render it. So we've now got that footage is sitting there in the media encoder. You've got loads of rendering options in here. You can render it for all different social media, Twitter, Vimeo, YouTube. You can render it so it doesn't have hardly any compression. I have one called Very Detailed, so if I want to then use that in a different film, you can render it in so many different ways. I'm going to go for YouTube 4K because I know I want lots of nice detail. I'm going to say where I want it to render to, which is this folder here, and then I hit play. And now if you look at the bottom, my computer is going to go through that frame by frame, and it's going to apply that, all those effects I did, the offsetting in time, the way I staggered the footage. It's going to look at the opacity. It's going through it frame by frame. You can actually see it if you look really closely. It's got the kind of preview window as it renders. So that's turning it into a final bit of footage. We're going to do a quick fast forward here so you don't have to sit here for 2 minutes, and then I'll show you how that footage looks. Okay, we're back to real time. I'm going to show you how that footage now looks in QuickTime Player. Let's make it full screen. So if I hit spacebar, that's nice. It's got a lovely smoothness to it. It's not going too quick. It's slowed down a little bit. get that really nice motion of the traffic. So yeah, that's by stretching time, so it's not a photograph every single frame, it's a photograph every 3 frames, and then creating that nice kind of motion blur behind it by offsetting the footage. I'm just going to show you one more fun thing you can do. You can take things even further in After Effects. So we have this comp that we've made, this comp here, which has got those 6 layers in. That's in our project bar. It's that top one there. If I drag that down to the make comp thing at the bottom there, then suddenly that comp is its own separate comp. What I'm going to try and do now is cut that up and make a kind of river of light. So it's going to use the blending mode technique we used in Photoshop a second ago. So let me show you what I'm going to do. I'll try and talk you through it. Like I say, this isn't the most detailed tutorial about After Effects, but if people are interested, let me know and I'll do a much more detailed one. So I'm going to duplicate that layer, and then I'm going to go to Edit, Split Layer. So now that layer we've brought in is split into 2. If I now move that along to the start and that along to the end, then I've totally muddled up time on that layer. Now we're going to copy that layer again, and we'll pick a point in the middle and we'll split layer, and now I'll swap those 2 over as well, and we'll move that over there. So I'm taking that footage and copying and pasting it and kind of offsetting time, and we'll do another split down this end of the footage. So split layer, and we'll drag that over to this side, and we'll drag that over to there, and maybe we'll do one more. So I'm going to copy that bottom layer again, and where shall I split it? I'll split it there because, no, I'll split it right near the end. So split layer, this will all make sense in a second, and then I'll drag that down there, and I'll drag that over there. Now we're going to use blending modes, but blending modes in After Effects. So that's the same bit of footage, but I've hacked it up into all sorts of different positions, so that footage is running over itself, but it's at totally different times, doing different things in each one. Now if I go to toggles and switches there, you've got blending modes there. It says mode. If I select all the layers, and then if I go open that, and then we look for that lighten blending mode and we click it, suddenly all those offset layers are overlapped, so the cars are in all sorts of different places at once. You might see the same car in about 3 different positions at once because I've chopped and kind of re-spliced time in loads of different ways. So suddenly that row's looking a lot busier. It's looking a lot more similar to that image I did in Photoshop. And then we can really push that. We can take that comp we've made where we've messed with time, and we can drag that down and make another comp of that. And then I can do exactly the same thing. I can copy that layer, paste that layer, and split that layer and do that again. So we're kind of multiplying and compounding this effect of offsetting time. There we go, and then I'll copy and paste, and I'll split that layer in the middle. Like I say, I'm going through this very, very quickly, so if you don't follow it, don't worry, but I just really want to show you all the fun things and how quick and spontaneous and creative it can be. If you know Photoshop, then I'm pretty convinced with a bit of time you'll be able to kind of rattle through After Effects in a very similar way. You'll be able to be really nice and spontaneous and kind of free-flowing with your ideas, because it is such a kind of intuitive bit of software once you get the principles of this timeline. Okay, so they're all overlapped again. Now if I go and select all those layers, and if we go to lighten again and click that, suddenly that row's looking incredibly busy. All those cars are showing multiple times at once now. You can see if I hit spacebar and it gives me a preview, it's going very, very slowly. That's because After Effects is having to think so hard at the moment. It's having to think of all those layers on layers on layers on layers. It's really compounded and detailed, but it's full of all this kind of texture and color. I'm going to do one last thing before I render that. At the moment that's looking, because it's so overlapped, the colors are looking a bit wishy-washy, so there's something called adjustment layers. So we go to layer, new adjustment layer there, and that is that you can apply a layer that affects all those layers underneath it. So I've got my adjustment layer selected. If I right click on that, and then if I go to effects, and let's have a look, we'll go color correction and curves. If I bring my black down, my white, oh, I didn't want to do that, my black down, and then pump a bit more light in, suddenly it's really punchy. Let's get rid of some of that red because it's not that sympathetic. Maybe inject a bit of blue so it's got a kind of minimalist coldness to it. And there we go. If we hit space, it moves very, very slowly. But if we now go to export, add to media encoder queue, there it is there, and it'll have the same compression, those YouTube 4K compression. So if I now just check where it's saving to, I didn't want to save it to there, I want to save it to there. I have a hit save and I hit play. Now it's going to render that, but that is going to take ages. Just see the timeline because it's got so much more things to think about. Each image is a product of such a compounded addition of layers on layers on layers. So that's probably going to take, yeah, it's going to take half an hour. So I'm not even going to do the fast forward thing. I'm just going to come back in half an hour when that's rendered, and I'll show you the footage and I'll talk to you about some final bits in that. So yeah, I hope that's been useful. Okay, so the bar has just gone all the way across and that footage has been rendered, that river of light. So let's have a look at it. So we'll open it up and here we go. If I hit the space bar, you see there we've got all that light at once, all those cars moving in different directions, and it's creating this lovely kind of movement of light. So yeah, I just kind of, without going into too much detail, I wanted to show how amazing After Effects is. If people want me to go into a bit more detail on After Effects, put in the comments and I can do a full tutorial that shows you the real basics of putting a kind of composite together in After Effects and some of the basic concepts. But I just wanted to use this to give you a little bit of a taste of what After Effects can do and how an understanding of Photoshop and taking photographs, that I just see it as there being such kind of crossovers. I don't see why there should be any difference between photography and video. I mean, they're just the same thing really. So modern cameras can film, can photograph, modern software can do a bit of everything as well. So it's just great just to not feel there's creative boundaries, and I feel like that bridge between After Effects and Photoshop, it really sort of represents that to me. It shows that you can kind of just, you know, it's just wherever your ideas take you. It's not, you're not a photographer anymore, you're not a filmmaker, you're just letting your ideas guide you and take you to interesting places. So I think you can probably get a demo on maybe like a 1 week demo or on After Effects. So have a play, and yeah, like I say, let me know if you'd like me to do a standalone tutorial on that, or if there's any other subjects you'd like me to go into in a bit more detail of the work I do and the ideas I share. Okay, on to the next bit. Okay, so we're in Blackpool for the final part of this tutorial. I came here because I've been looking at the weather forecast all day and it's clear skies, so I've driven about an hour to get a nice clear sky so I can show you good photography of the moon, hopefully some nice photographs of the stars. I'm seeing them behind you over the Irish Sea, and then maybe a little bit of the artificial light here. You've got the Blackpool Tower behind me in all its glory, so I'll quickly show you some interesting tips on how to kind of make good judgments about your composition when there's a lot of chaos, a lot of light moving around. So we'll have a look at those three things in Blackpool, and that will kind of wrap this tutorial up. Okay, so we're looking at the Blackpool Tower here. Sometimes at night you get a lot of kind of chaotic light moving in lots of directions, and it can become a little bit tricky to make good decisions about your composition. So for example here, there's a kind of interesting textures on the sand which look good, but it's a little bit hard to make that overall call about what a good composition is. So often when I'm about to take a photograph, I step back and I sort of squint at the view, and if you squint you just see the basic sort of compositional elements, and this works in daytime as well as nighttime, so it's not exclusively a night photography tip. But I remember my first ever photography teacher, a guy called Bob, teaching me, one of the first things he taught us was just squint at a view and you'll see the basic sort of compositional elements. So I'm just going to sort of simulate that now by really knocking my camera out of focus, just to kind of get close to what it feels like when you squint, and you just suddenly start seeing in kind of blocks and you get a sense of maybe the proportions a little bit better. Sometimes when it's all perfectly sharp it's just a little bit distracting. Everything's there. Do that and you're suddenly down to the very basic elements, the blue, the reflection, the lights. So like that, I maybe think a composition bang center might look good, or off center. So it's just a little tip. It might not work for you, but usually when I'm out photographing I squint now and again just to get a sense of the detail and sense of what's looking good in the photograph. So I'm going to quickly do this shot. I'm going to move to photography settings on my camera. So I've looked at this view through squinted eyes to get a sense of the sort of composition, and I think the two things that are really jumping out at me are that sort of juxtaposition, that play of light of the tower, that really vivid blue against the kind of tungsten light, the golden colours. They're the things that I think are going to be the key of this photograph. So I've decided to make the most of those. I want to pan my camera left and right as well, so not just have the tower central, but have that strip of yellow showing more. So I'm going to now try and find a good exposure. So I've got my camera at ISO 500 as usual and f5, so I've got a bit of depth of field there, and I'll start with a half a second exposure. That's looking okay, but it could be brighter, I think. So let's push that up to a full second exposure and see how that's looking. This should hopefully, that's great. Yeah, there's a real sort of radiation of light from the tower, and I love those textures in the sand. In fact, I'm going to just tip the camera forward a bit more so I can really focus on that sand, because I think that's the really exciting part of the picture. Okay, so I'm going to take, I've got that, I love that 1 second exposure. I'll take a picture. That looks great. And then really to make the most of this view and that yellow and blue, the way they sit together, I'm going to pan left now and do a shot to the left, and I'm going to go even further and do another shot to the left. And that blueness is sort of fading out on the sand a little bit. So I know that as I put these shots together, we'll have a lovely pool of blue right in front of the tower that slowly fades out. Now I'm going to go right at the tower and I'll take another picture, and I'm going to go right even further and I'll take one last picture just for luck. And there is a tutorial in my playlist all about how to stitch these panoramics together. I actually stitched 9 photographs together in that one. In this it's going to be about 5 or 6. So there's a link below to that to really show the skills, but I'll quickly show you in Photoshop how I put these images together just to give you the starting point on panoramics. But yeah, that should be a really nice one to work on, hopefully. Opened up these pictures from the Blackpool beach in Photoshop. I'm going to do a very quick demonstration how to stitch these photographs together. As I mentioned, if you go below, there's a tutorial called photo stitching or photography stitching, and it's all about how to shoot these elements and also how to put them together. And it goes into much more detail than this. And also in that one, we look at a grid of images, so images that sit above it as well. In this, we're just moving left and right to do our panoramic. So let me just quickly show you how I start joining images together. We get our center image, the first one we took, and now I use the crop tool, which is in the toolbar, and then we extend the image, give ourselves loads of room. Do I want it? I don't think I want it to be that weird peach colour, so I'm just going to undo that. So, oh, there we go. Let's go for a white colour behind it so it's not too distracting. And we'll drag that. Ah, peach again. Annoying. Okay. White, success. I feel better now. Okay, now hit return, and I use the crop tool not to crop into the image, but to crop the image so it's wider. Now I'm just going to make it wider in this direction as well. Oh, peach! Where's that peach keep coming from? I do apologise. Okay, there we go. White. We like white, we don't like peach. Okay, so now I'm going to bring the image to the left and I'm going to join it. So I click on that and then I'm going to go select all and then edit menu, and we go to copy in there, and then we can close that because it's copied it and remembered it, and then we paste. Where's paste? There we go. And now I zoom in and we see the two images as two separate layers. So keep an eye on the layer palette on the right. That's this palette here, and that's how all the different images interact. Now, if I go to the move tool, I can position that where I want that new image. And if I put the opacity of it down to around about 50, it's see-through, so I can just sit it roughly where it should be. I'm just going to zoom in slightly. And yeah, that looks okay. As long as you've got the move tool selected, you can use the cursor keys, the arrow keys on your keyboard, just to nudge it around.
That's looking all right, but there is something, it never quite lines up. We're looking for there to be a line where the two images sit on top of each other, not that entire area to overlap precisely, but just there to be a point. You see how the sand, the lines in the sand there are kind of looking really overlap there. They're nice and clear, but as soon as you get left of there, it's getting a bit offset, and as soon as you get right there, it's getting a bit offset. As long as there's one bit where it sits comfortably on top, that's the bit where one image hands to the other, and it's not quite doing that as well as I want yet. So I'm going to use the transform tool. I'll use free transform, and now I can scale. I can, if I hold down the command key, I can move the corners around, and we can get that layer where one image hands over to the next as lined up as possible. So I'm just holding down the command key and slowly nudging it around, and we've got that nice line straight up there where it's overlapping well. I've hit return. The new image that I introduced is now slightly off square. Let me just put the opacity back up on that. So it's slightly, it's kind of lifted a bit at the top. It's slightly skewed so we can line it up nicely. Now if we make a layer mask on that, so click on the layer mask tool. I want a white one at this stage, so I'm not holding down the option key. Now if I get my brush tool, which is over here, and if I make it black, because I'm going to be painting black on the white layer mask, and then zoom in, basically if I'm painting black, let me just do a demonstration over here. I eat a hole in the layer it's attached to, so I've eaten a hole in that one we've introduced. I want that hole to be over here, so one image hands over nicely to the other. At the moment we've got that straight edge there, which you can't really see, but if I was to zoom in, let me just undo that a couple, would see that that new image on top is overlapping in an awkward way over here. So I need to, using a black brush on that layer mask, slowly eat away at that until we get to that point where they overlapped and sat nicely on top of each other. And I know there's a line somewhere down the beach here, somewhere in the sand it overlaps. Okay, I'm not doing this perfectly, but it's working okay for a demo. And then let me make a bigger brush and get a nice subtle blend in the sky. So now that's handing over quite well along those lines, but we've got all this weirdness left here, so I know I can just get rid of all that leftover detail that's to the left of that line, because it's not going to be useful. And I've done this very, very quickly, and I've used a few keyboard shortcuts, which isn't very kind if you're watching the tutorial. But I just wanted to show the basic process that you hand from one image to the other. One image where the camera faces in front of me to an image where the camera faces slightly left. I'm now going to rattle through all of the other images, joining them up, so you'll see a nice sped up version of that, and then I'll join you at the end and tell you about flattening it and kind of making the final image. Like I say, this is incredibly quick, so go to the link below. There's a whole tutorial called photo stitching which goes into this in much finer detail, which I hope will be useful. So we're going to go to the fast forwardy bit now. Okay, so we're back to normal speed. I'm going to show you the final steps. I've stitched those 6 images together, and we've got that lovely wideness there, which is what I was aiming for. That's that idea that we squint and see the detail, and see the detail that might look appealing in a photograph. Now you can see it there, you can see that whole view and how that's come together nicely. So it's at the moment all separate layers with layer masks attached. If you save that as a Photoshop document or a large document or a TIFF with layers, let me just show you that actually, with the layer box checked down here, then it will remember all of that layer information. You can go back into it if you need to. Don't need to, so I'm just going to flatten it. All that separate information just becomes one picture, and we can start then cropping into it and making it look like something a little bit more final. And sometimes when you build panoramics, the edges go a bit odd, so you can use free transform tools. So I'll go select all and then image and free transform, and then we can, again using the command key, take the corners of the image and we can just nudge it around. I'm careful not, I don't want the tower to look too wonky, but I can bring in some extra detail there. There is also a really nice transform tool where you can do a kind of more liquid transform, and you can just move certain bits in certain ways. So we could maybe bring a bit of that middle detail, make the tower a bit taller. We can make the horizon a little bit nicer shape, bring in a bit from the bottom there. That's free transform, and then there's switch between free transform and warp modes. So this is a warp mode where you can really drag the image all over. It's almost like just this liquid thing you can sort of play with, which is good fun, especially when you create a panoramic and the edges become a little bit odd, because you might want to go in and just tidy them up. So let's do that. I'll take a second to process because it has a bit of thinking to do. And now I'm just going to crop into that, and we should have a really nice sparkly image of the beach in Blackpool. Let me just make that a bit bigger. Wrong way. There you go, and it's got all those lovely colours there. I'm just going to transform it a bit because that horizon's dipping a bit on the left hand side, and I tipped the camera forward so we've got all that lovely detail of the beach, all that lovely texture there. That's something I really wanted. Yeah, you can then work into it a bit more. You could make nice big selections of areas of the image. So let's have a look. Where's my lasso tool? Oh, I didn't want to do that. So we could do a big lasso of the ground there, where there's that lovely reflection going on already, and we could select and feather that lasso by, let's go 125 pixels, and then I can then, let's keep that, go in and bring out even more highlights, make it even more contrasty on the sand. So give it a bit more bling, or that shape of the tower, which is doing nice things already. I can select and then feather, and then I can really make that shine. So I tend to use curves, but you could use levels, so you can really punch up that brightness in curves. Maybe even bring a bit of colour to it. Maybe even there's that lovely blue. So let's see what happens if we bring in even more blue. Really make it sort of radiate. So that's it. You build it and then you flatten it. And once it's flattened, you can then have lots of fun with the colours, make it even more vivid, and or even this one might be one that's some good details come out if we introduce some blues across the whole thing. So yeah, I hope that's useful. But like I say, if you go down below, you'll see a link through to an entire tutorial on stitching panoramics, which goes into this in much finer detail. So yeah, it's a good fun technique, and it's a start technique for loads of other skills. If you can get your head around this, then lots of other kind of composite creative ways of using Photoshop start clicking into place. Kind of the world is your oyster if you can get your head around simple stitching. Okay, on to the next thing.
I'm going to share another quick tip now about getting the best out of nighttime photographs. Earlier on in this tutorial we looked at setting up your tripod really well, getting it really firm and solid to the ground, locking it off, keeping it nice and steady. Now when you start using a really long lens, a 300mm, which I'm using here, let me just show you what I'm photographing, then it's even more important than ever that your camera's super steady, because any movement is really amplified. Any slight movement of your camera is really amplified. And when you're working with 1 second exposures, 2 second exposures, quite long exposures, then yeah, you start seeing movement, and something as subtle as you pressing your finger on the shutter can create a tiny bit of motion blur, and even you taking your hand off the camera can create a tiny bit of blur. So let me just do that. So there, if we zoom right into that image, you can see there's blur going on, and that's because I wasn't that careful about pressing my shutter down, and how I took my hand off, you get a bit of motion blur. There's a really good way of cutting that out quite well, and that is by putting your camera on a self timer. So I've put this on a 3-second self timer, and I'm pressing the shutter now, and nothing's happened, and my hand isn't touching the camera, and there's my 1 second exposure. And because it waited, the camera was no longer shaking from me holding it, it was perfectly still because there wasn't still the movement of me either pressing the shutter or letting go of the shutter. So you get a lovely sharp image full of really nice detail. So it's just worth thinking about that. If you're noticing that when you're shooting night photography with a very long lens, that you're getting a little bit of motion blur, it might be the fact that you're pressing the shutter that's causing it. So simply put it onto self-timer and do a 3 second, 5 second or something like that self-timer, and by the time the photograph is taken, the camera stopped moving and you should get sharper images. There's other things you can do if you really want to explore this and cut out any chance of motion blur from the photograph being taken. There's things like mirror up shooting. On an SLR camera, there's a mirror that is, if the reason you see what the camera is seeing is because there's a mirror behind the lens that reflects the image up into your eye. Every time you take a photograph, that mirror fires up. That's why you hear the loud click, and it's not a very subtle, quiet camera, and then exposes the image to the chip inside the camera and then puts the mirror down. Now that very process of the mirror coming up can create a tiny bit of motion blur as well. So some cameras have mirror up photography, so that mirror's already up, you take the picture and you don't get that extra rattle, so you get smoother pictures, which when you're photographing the star, when you've got 300mm lens on, is useful. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, but it's worth knowing. If you look in your manual, you might find your camera does it. But the self-timer is a more simple version of that. You just use that 3 seconds to let the camera settle after you touching it, or that 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and everything should be a bit sharper and a bit more still. So I hope that's useful. So we've just been looking at artificial light at the picture of the tower, and now we're going to show a different view from this exact same point. We're going to pan round away from all those lights of Blackpool. Just keep moving until what looks like absolute pitch black, and we've got the camera now pointing out to sea, out to the Irish Sea, and it looks pitch black, but actually we're going to use those long exposures again and pull out detail we can barely see with our eyes. There's just some stars there, so we're going to do some photography of the stars now, and I'm going to show you a few techniques about keeping the camera steady for long exposures of the stars. So I'm just going to quickly show you how, using the camera, you can see how busy the universe is with stars. So I've located Mars in the sky, and I've used autofocus to get a nice sharp focus on it, and I'm going to really push my ISO on this. I'm going to push it right up to 20,000, which is a lot higher than I ever have before. I'm using a very long lens, 70 to 300mm lens. I'm zoomed right in at 300. I'm going for the widest aperture I can, which is 5.6 on this. And I'm going to start with a 1 second exposure looking at Mars, and we'll see what we can see. Okay, so we can see quite a lot of detail there already, so that's really good. You can see in the center there's Mars really glowing. I'm going to go for a quicker exposure of that, just so, see if we can get some of that colour of Mars. I'll go for a 40th of a second. Let's have a look. None's really coming out, but anyway, that's how it looks to the eye, basically. I can see that with my eyes. So let's go right up to, we started at a second, so let's go for 4 seconds now, and we'll see how much there is around it. Mars will really start glowing now. Let's have a look. Mars is really glowing, and you can start to see loads of stars around it. Let's make that even brighter still. That's 8 seconds, and hopefully we should start seeing just countless stars around it, which this is just such a small, whoa, that's incredibly bright. This is just a small section of the night sky. There's so much detail in just that small section, which I love. It's really good to use a camera, and through these long exposures and with just a tripod and a long lens, you see all this beautiful detail, stuff that you just wouldn't realise was there. You see maybe 100 stars, maybe 150 stars when you look up, but when your eyes really adjust, or when you use a camera, you see millions, countless, which is brilliant. I love that. Okay, I just want to share this shot as well. As I was leaving the beach, I noticed a really beautiful reflection of the tower, and when I zoomed right on it on my lens and let the tower be out of focus, it created this beautiful effect on the light, letting that be out of focus in the distance, a kind of mix of sharpness and blur. Sometimes the great thing about night photography is it does something you'd never expect, and I think this shot shows that. It's a kind of really beautiful, unexpected detail that I wasn't planning, but it came out really interesting, and it's a really interesting effect of the light that you'd never quite expect. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is how to photograph the moon. It's a really good first step on astrophotography, and if you look up in the sky above me there, you've just got a crescent moon Very red at the moment because it's just come up over the horizon, so it's going through a lot of atmosphere there, so it's got that kind of warmth and red colour to it. So I'm going to show you how to photograph that. When it's a full moon and the sun is hitting it flat on, you can almost shoot it handheld, but because it's not a full moon and because it's quite low on the horizon, it's not being hit that directly by the sun, so it's not that bright tonight. There's not a huge amount of light hitting it, so we're going to have to use quite a long exposure with the moon on a tripod. But when it's really bright and when it's a full moon, you can almost handheld it. It's good to have a tripod as well because that's where you'll get it super sharp, but it's amazing how much detail there is when the full sunlight's hitting it. So we're going to go to camera now and I'm going to show you some nice settings, how to focus, how to get your exposure right on the moon, and how to keep the camera nice and steady. Okay, so hopefully we'll have a picture of that in a few minutes. So before we photograph the moon, I just wanted to show a very quick bit of video footage of this moon, and just tell you about two things to bear in mind when you're photographing the moon. There's number one, the rotation of the Earth. Hopefully you'll see, if I zoom in on the moon, that it's slowly creeping across the image, and that's the rotation of the Earth. The camera, the tripod and everything's staying in a pretty stationary position. It might be wobbling slightly in the wind, but on the whole it's pretty steady. So the moon is slowly creeping across the sky, and you don't tend to notice it so much if you've got a very wide angle lens, or even if you're looking at it yourself, because we see such a wide expanse of the sky, we don't notice that kind of movement. But when you've got a very, very long zoom lens and it's only showing a small section of the sky in front of you, it kind of amplifies that movement. So you see the blur of the stars, you see the movement of the moon, and then the sun going through the sky in the day is all amplified if you use a very long lens. There's also another thing that's a little bit harder to notice, but it's atmospheric distortion. Between the camera lens and the moon, there's a lot of the Earth's atmosphere, and that distorts light. It moves light around, it kind of distorts it. Some days more than others, some days the atmospheric distortion is quite low, and that's why if you look up at stars you see them twinkle, because that's the atmospheric distortion. The stars are this almost infinitely small speck of light from such a long way away, and the twinkle is that light coming through the Earth's atmosphere and being distorted by the atmosphere. And the moon will be doing that as well. So you might notice it here, the moon kind of is shimmering slightly. That's why it's quite good when it's a full moon, or if you can, to do a very quick exposure of the moon, because that atmospheric distortion over a second can kind of make it look very soft and out of focus. That's one thing to bear in mind. If you know you've got it sharp and in focus but it still looks soft, and you know the camera's not moving, then it could be the atmospheric distortion that's causing that softness. And it happens in daytime as well. If you stick a really long lens on your camera and photograph a city from a distance and really look closely, the straight lines are kind of crinkled slightly. So just keep an eye open for atmospheric distortion, because it's one of those things that you kind of don't really see straight away, but it's there, especially with a long lens. It becomes quite obvious. Okay, we're going to move over to taking photographs of this, and I'll show you some good settings and how to get your image of the moon lovely and sharp. I've got a very, very long lens on my camera, a 70 to 300mm, and I'm zoomed right in. And the moon is still quite small in the image, but I know that this camera and a lot of modern cameras, even if the moon is quite small, you still pick out quite a lot of detail. So I'm looking at the moon through the camera, and I'm going to use autofocus to get it nice and sharp and in focus. And basically, I know that there's quite a lot of atmospheric distortion today. The moon was kind of shivering and blurring because of that atmospheric distortion. So I want to try and get quite a quick exposure of the moon. So I'm going to open this lens up as wide as possible. It's a zoom lens, so it hasn't got that wide an aperture. So I'm going to open it up to 5.6, which lets as much light as possible in through the lens. And then I'm going to push my ISO a little bit higher than usual, and I have with a lot of these night ones, to 1000, just so I can get a really quick exposure. And then I'm going to do an exposure that's similar to the night ones we've been doing so far, just to demonstrate something. So I'm going to do a second exposure at f5.6 and an ISO of 1000. Okay, there's our second exposure, and this shows the moon is really bright compared to a lot of the other objects you'll see in the night sky. Compared to stars, it's so much brighter because essentially it's an object that's being hit by sunlight, directly by sunlight, and particularly when you've got a full moon, so much light is hitting it, it's so dazzling and bright that you almost don't need a tripod, you can almost shoot handheld, because it is an object being hit by the sun, and we know in the middle of the day any object being hit by the sun is really, really bright. Tonight it's not quite so bright as you see it on some nights, because it's low in the atmosphere, and it's just, I mean, it's not quite a crescent moon, but it's a very sort of slight moon. The sun isn't hitting it that much, or isn't hitting it straight on from our perspective. So let me get my focus on the moon, and I'm going to go for a quicker shutter speed. I'm going to go for a 1/5 of a second, and let's see what detail we're getting there. It's still too bright, so let's go right down to a 40th of a second and see how that's looking. Now that's getting closer, we're starting to see some detail in that, and now we'll go for a 100th of a second. Let's see how that is. That's looking a tiny bit dark, so we'll try a 60th. And that's great. That's the kind of detail I want. So I'm just going to check my focus by using spot focus on my camera and getting the moon right in the middle and using autofocus. And then I'm going to use that trick where we put the self timer on for 3 seconds, so there's no motion blur for my hand, and we should get a nice sharp image of the moon. Okay, there's that photograph. There's quite a lot of detail there. I'm just going to zoom in on the back of my camera to see how that's looking, and that's looking okay. We're sort of seeing some craters and nice shapes to it. I'm just going to check the focus again and do another one of that, and here we go. Yep, so that's a fairly quick exposure of a 60th of a second to keep it nice and sharp, not let that rotation of the earth create any blur, and not let that atmospheric distortion create any blur. Compared to photographing a lot of the objects in the sky, it's relatively easy, so see if you can get out there and photograph the moon, borrow a tripod, see if you can get a long lens, and just experiment with a range of exposures, but check your focus is there, look out for that atmospheric distortion, and hopefully if you bear all those in mind, you should start seeing some details of craters and some nice texture. I think the line where you see the shadow on the moon, so the line where it goes from the sunlight hitting it to the shadowy bit, is called the terminator, which is a really cool name, and that's the point where you see the nice shadows of the craters, particularly when you get a half moon, because the sun is kind of really skimming across it and creating nice 3D depth to the craters. So look out for that, because that's the point where it gets really nice and defined, and you start seeing some lovely shape that you can really pick out in your photographs. And yeah, I hope you have some fun with that. Yeah, that brings this night tutorial to an end. I hope it's been useful. I've covered a lot, and if you've watched it all, great. If you've just dipped in and watched a few bits, I hope those bits have been useful. There's lots more tutorials in my playlist, so have a look through there, subscribe to that, and if you know anyone else that might benefit from these or enjoy these tutorials, please let them know about them, and I'll be adding more over the next few weeks, so keep your eyes open, and thanks for watching.